Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Think about that quietly. Let the question settle, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the story. The basement of the Central Police Station stretched beneath the city like a forgotten memory. Its corridors lined with metal shelving that reached toward fluorescent lights humming their quiet song. Here, in the archives, time moved differently. The air itself seemed thicker, weighted with decades of documentation. Each file folder a small monument to events that had once stirred the surface world above. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered this place during her third week on the force, 15 years ago now. She'd been looking for storage space for her lunch and had pushed open the heavy door marked Archives, Authorized Personnel Only. What she found was a labyrinth of files that stretched back to the 1940s, organized by a system that seemed to follow its own logic. Cabinets arranged not just by year, but by some deeper understanding of how stories connected to one another. Tonight, as the city settled into its late hours, she found herself here again. The building above was mostly empty, save for the skeleton crew manning the dispatch desk and the officers walking their beats, through streets that glistened with the faint moisture of evening fog. Down here, the temperature remained constant, a cool 68 degrees that preserved both paper and memory with equal care. The first cabinet she approached bore the faded label 1962-1963, cases 4004-499. The metal drawer slid open with a whisper, revealing manila folders arranged like sleeping sentries, each one containing the careful documentation of someone's worst day. But here, in the archives, those days had been transformed into something else entirely. They had become part of the city's quiet breath, its long memory of what happened when ordinary life encountered its own shadows. File 4127 lay near the front, its tab worn smooth by fingers that had pulled it from this drawer countless times over the decades. The case involved a missing person report filed on a Tuesday morning in October. 1962, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had walked into the station that day wearing a navy blue coat and carrying a purse that matched her shoes. She had spoken to Officer Reynolds about her husband, who had failed to return from his evening walk 3 days prior. The report, typed on an IBM Selectric with a ribbon that had seen better days, described Harold Hartwell as a man of routine. Each evening at 7:15, he would leave their apartment on Maple Street for a 40-minute walk that took him through the downtown district and along the river before returning home by 8 o'clock. His route never varied. Mrs. Hartwell knew this because she would time his absence by the radio program she listened to while he was gone. On the evening of October 14, 1962, Harold had kissed his wife goodbye as always, taken his walking stick from the umbrella stand by the door, and stepped into the crisp autumn air Mrs. Hartwell had settled into her chair with her knitting and turned on the radio to catch the end of the evening news. The announcer's voice filled their small living room with reports of distant events, political developments that seemed to belong to another world entirely. By 8:30, when Harold should have been home for 20 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell had turned off the radio and moved to the window. The street below remained empty except for the occasional car carrying someone home from work or an evening out. She had waited by that window until well past midnight, watching for the familiar figure of her husband walking beneath the streetlights with his measured, unhurried pace. The police report detailed the search that followed. Officer Reynolds and his partner had walked Harold's usual route twice, once in daylight and once after dark, trying to understand where a man could simply vanish from a path he had traveled hundreds of times before. They spoke to shopkeepers who recognized Harold from his evening walks, to residents who had seen him pass their windows night after night with clockwork regularity. Everyone remembered him, but no one had seen him on that particular Tuesday evening. It was as if he had stepped out of his apartment building and into some space between moments, a gap in the city's memory where even the most routine presence could disappear without explanation. The investigation had continued for 6 weeks, the file growing thicker with each passing day. Detective Morrison, who had taken over the case from Officer Reynolds, had compiled a careful chronology of Harold's life, searching for anything that might explain his absence. Harold worked at the municipal water department, where he had been employed for 23 years without incident. His supervisor described him as reliable and methodical, the kind of man who arrived precisely at 8 each morning and left at exactly 5 in the afternoon. His colleagues knew little about his personal life beyond his marriage to Eleanor and his habit of bringing his lunch in the same brown paper bag every day. He ate alone at his desk, reading the newspaper while he consumed sandwiches that Eleanor prepared each morning before he left for work. He was neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply present in the way that some people manage to be both visible and invisible at the same time. The financial records painted a picture of a man who lived within careful boundaries. Harold and Eleanor maintained a single checking account at First National Bank, with deposits arriving as regularly as Harold's paychecks and withdrawals, limited to groceries, utilities, and the small pleasures of a modest life. There had been no unusual transactions in the weeks leading up to Harold's disappearance. No sudden withdrawals or unexpected purchases that might suggest planning or desperation. Detective Morrison had interviewed Eleanor Hartwell 6 times during those 6 weeks, each conversation adding small details to the growing portrait of a marriage that seemed to exist in the same careful rhythm as Harold's evening walks. They had been married for 18 years, had no children, and lived a life that others might have found impossibly quiet, but which had suited them both perfectly. Eleanor described Harold as a man who found comfort in predictability. He read the same newspaper every morning, ate lunch at the same time every day, and had worn the same style of shoes for as long as she had known him. Their conversations followed familiar patterns: discussions of weather and neighborhood happenings, gentle observations about the changing seasons and the small dramas of the people who lived around them. On the evening Harold disappeared, they had eaten dinner together as always. Eleanor remembered preparing pot roast with potatoes and carrots, a meal Harold particularly enjoyed on cool autumn evenings. They had discussed the new family that had moved into the apartment across the hall, wondering quietly about the young couple who carried their groceries up the stairs in brown paper bags that looked identical to the ones Harold took to work. After dinner, Harold had helped Eleanor clear the table, a routine they had perfected over nearly 2 decades of shared meals. He had folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate, then stood and kissed Eleanor's cheek before retrieving his walking stick from its place by the door. She remembered the sound of his footsteps in the hallway outside their apartment, growing fainter as he descended the stairs toward the street. The case file contained photographs taken along Harold's usual route, black and white images that captured the downtown district as it existed in October 1962. The building stood solid and permanent, their brick facades reflecting an era when construction was meant to last centuries rather than decades. Shop windows displayed goods arranged with careful attention to symmetry and appeal, while sidewalks stretched in straight lines that suggested order and predictability. Detective Morrison had walked this route himself dozens of times, at different hours and in varying weather conditions, trying to understand not just where Harold might have gone, but how someone could vanish from a path that offered so few opportunities for deviation. The route took Harold past Morrison's drugstore, where Mr. Morrison knew him by sight and always nodded when Harold passed the large front window each evening. Past the drugstore, Harold's path led him down Main Street toward the river, a gentle decline that took him past the old Carnegie Library and the small park where elderly men played chess on stone tables. even as autumn's chill began to settle over the city. Harold never stopped at the park, according to the witnesses Detective Morrison had interviewed. But he would slow his pace slightly as he passed, as if the sight of others enjoying their evening rituals gave him some quiet satisfaction. The river marked the turning point of Harold's walk. He would reach the embankment, pause for precisely 3 minutes while looking out over the water, then turn and retrace his steps back toward home. Several people had noticed this habit, the way Harold would stand at the same spot each evening, his hands resting on his walking stick while he watched the water move past the city with its ancient, unhurried flow. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in an apartment overlooking the river, had observed Harold's evening pause from her kitchen window for months before his disappearance. She described him as a figure of such regularity that she had begun to time her evening dishwashing by his arrival. When Harold reached the riverbank each night, Mrs. Patterson would begin clearing her dinner dishes, knowing that by the time she finished washing and drying them, Harold would be walking back past her building toward home. On the night of October 14th, Mrs. Patterson had waited by her kitchen window, her hands poised over the warm dishwater, but Harold never appeared. She had assumed, she told Detective Morrison, that Harold might have changed his routine for some reason, perhaps because of the weather or a change in his schedule. It wasn't until several days later, when she noticed his continued absence, that she began to wonder if something had happened to the quiet man, whose presence had become such a reliable part of her evening routine. The case file also contained a detailed map of the area, hand-drawn by Detective Morrison with careful attention to every alley, doorway, and potential hiding place along Harold's route. Morrison had marked each location where witnesses had reported seeing Harold on previous evenings, creating a pattern that showed how thoroughly Harold's presence had been woven into the fabric of the neighborhood's daily life. Yet for all this documentation, all these careful observations and measured investigations, Harold Hartwell had simply vanished. The case remained open for 2 years before being transferred to the inactive files, where it joined thousands of other mysteries that the city had been unable to solve. Eleanor continued to visit the police station every few months, asking whether there had been any developments, any new information that might explain her husband's absence. Detective Morrison had retired in 1975, but not before adding a final note to Harold's file. He wrote that in 13 years of police work, he had never encountered a disappearance that seemed to violate the basic logic of human behavior so completely. People vanished for reasons, Morrison wrote, even when those reasons were hidden from everyone else. They ran away from debts or marriages or crimes they had committed. They suffered accidents that carried them beyond the reach of identification. They made impulsive decisions that seemed completely out of character, but which, upon investigation, revealed themselves to be the culmination of pressures that had been building for months or years. Harold Hartwell, Detective Morrison concluded, had simply stepped out of his life and into silence, leaving behind no clues, no explanations, and no trail that even the most determined investigation could follow. The case remained a reminder that the city, for all its order and predictability, still contained spaces where the inexplicable could occur without warning or reason. In the years that followed Harold's disappearance, the downtown district had changed around the memory of his evening walks. Morrison's drugstore had closed in 1968, replaced by a small restaurant that served coffee and sandwiches to workers from the nearby office buildings. The chess players had gradually disappeared from the park, replaced by younger people who used the space for different kinds of gathering and recreation. The Carnegie Library had undergone renovation in 1971, its facade cleaned and its interior updated to accommodate new methods of organizing and accessing information. Mrs. Patterson had moved away in 1973, leaving behind the apartment window where she had waited each evening for the violin sight of Harold's familiar figure walking toward the river. Yet, Harold's absence continued to echo. through the neighborhood in ways that were difficult to define or measure. The people who had known him by sight, who had incorporated his regular presence into their own evening routines, found themselves occasionally looking for him, even years after his disappearance. There was something about the predictability of his walks that had created a small space of order in their daily lives, and when that space suddenly became empty, it left behind a feeling that was part mystery and part loss. Eleanor Hartwell had continued to live in their apartment on Maple Street until her death in 1984. Neighbors reported that she maintained Harold's evening routine in her own way, standing by their living room window each evening at 7:15 and again at 8 o'clock, as if she were still timing his familiar journey through the downtown streets. The apartment building superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, had noticed that Eleanor never changed anything in their apartment after Harold's disappearance. His walking stick remained in its place by the door, and his side of their bed stayed neatly made but unslept in. Eleanor continued to set 2 places at their small dining table each evening, though she ate her meals alone while listening to the same radio programs that had once accompanied Harold's walks. When Eleanor died, her sister came from out of state to settle her affairs and found their apartment preserved exactly as it had been on the night Harold failed to return home. His clothes remained in their shared dresser, arranged with the same careful precision that had characterized every aspect of his daily life. His favorite coffee cup sat in the kitchen cabinet, washed and waiting for a morning that had never arrived. The sister, Mrs. Judith Morgan, had contacted the police before clearing out the apartment, wondering whether Harold's personal effects might contain some clue that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Detective Williams, who had inherited Harold's case file when Detective Morrison retired, spent an afternoon going through Harold's belongings with Mrs. Morgan, searching for anything that might finally explain what had happened on that October evening in 1962. They found nothing unusual among Harold's possessions. His clothes were well maintained but unremarkable, the wardrobe of a man who dressed for comfort and durability rather than fashion or impression. His few books were classics that he had owned for years, their pages worn from repeated reading, but offering no insights into his state of mind or hidden concerns. In Harold's dresser drawer, they discovered a small notebook where he had recorded observations about his evening walks. The entries were brief and matter-of-fact, noting changes in the weather, seasonal variations in the downtown landscape, and small incidents he had witnessed during his regular journey through the neighborhood. October 10th, Morrison's window display changed to include winter scarves, temperature dropping noticeably. October 12th, new couple at chess table in park, older man teaching younger woman the game. October 13th, Mrs. Patterson's kitchen light stayed on later than usual. Hope she's well. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1962, written in Harold's careful handwriting. Feeling particularly grateful for the routine tonight. The city looks peaceful in this light. Detective Williams had studied this entry for a long time, searching for any hint of premonition or farewell in Harold's words. But the sentence seemed to express nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found contentment in the simple rhythm of his daily life. There was no suggestion that Harold anticipated any change in his circumstances. No indication that he was planning to break the pattern that had defined his evenings for so many years. Mrs. Morgan donated Harold's notebook to the police archives, where it became part of the growing file that documented his disappearance and the investigation that followed. The notebook joined the witness statements, the photographs, the maps, and the reports that Detective Morrison had compiled during his 2-year effort to understand what had happened to a man who seemed to have vanished from the middle of his own life. The file cabinet containing Harold's case also held hundreds of other unsolved disappearances, each one representing someone who had stepped out of their familiar world and into mystery. Some cases were more dramatic than Harold's, involving people who had clearly been running from something or towards something. Their disappearances explicable, even if their current whereabouts remained unknown. Others shared the same inexplicable quality that made Harold's case so disturbing to the officers who had worked on it. These were people who had simply stopped existing in their previous lives without apparent reason, leaving behind jobs and relationships and daily routines that had seemed to satisfy them completely. Detective Williams often found himself returning to Harold's file during quiet moments in the archives, drawn by the case's perfect lack of resolution. The file represented something that rarely existed in police work, a complete mystery that offered no satisfactory explanation, despite thorough investigation. It was a reminder that the city, for all its documentation and surveillance and careful record-keeping, still contained spaces where people could disappear as completely as if they had never existed at all. Asterisk, the downtown district continued to change in the decades following Harold's disappearance. The buildings that had witnessed his evening walks were gradually renovated or replaced, their facades updated to reflect changing architectural styles and commercial needs. The riverbank where Harold had paused each evening was developed into a small park with benches and walking paths that attracted different kinds of evening visitors. Yet Harold's absence remained woven into the neighborhood's memory in ways that persisted despite these physical changes. Local residents who had lived in the area during the 1960s would occasionally share stories about the quiet man who had walked the same route every evening until he simply stopped appearing. These stories took on different qualities as they were passed from one generation to the next, becoming part of the neighborhood's folklore, while remaining grounded in the documented facts of Harold's life and disappearance. The police archives continued to grow around Harold's file, new cases arriving each year to join the thousands of folders that documented the city's ongoing encounter with crime and mystery. Some cases were solved quickly, their files transferred to the closed case section after brief investigations that revealed straightforward explanations for seemingly puzzling events. Others remained open for years, their files growing thicker as investigators pursued various leads and theories without reaching definitive conclusions. These ongoing cases created their own rhythm in the archives, files that were regularly accessed and updated as new information became available or as fresh perspectives were brought to old evidence. But Harold's file had achieved a different kind of status in the archives. It had become a symbol of the irreducible mystery that sometimes entered people's lives without warning or explanation. Officers who worked in the missing persons division often found themselves studying Harold's case as an example of how thoroughly someone could vanish despite living a life that seemed to offer no opportunities for concealment or escape. File served as a reminder that investigation, however thorough and methodical, sometimes encountered limits that could not be overcome through additional effort or different approaches. Harold's disappearance represented one of those limits, a point where the systematic pursuit of facts and evidence reached a boundary beyond which only speculation and wonder could proceed. Detective Chun had first encountered Harold's file during her second year in the Missing Persons Division. She had been working on a similar case, another routine disappearance that seemed to defy logical explanation. When Sergeant Rodriguez had suggested she review some of the older unsolved cases to gain perspective on the patterns that sometimes emerged in such investigations, Harold's file had captured her attention immediately, not because it offered any insights into her current case, but because it demonstrated how a disappearance could be both completely documented and completely inexplicable at the same time. Every aspect of Harold's life had been thoroughly investigated and carefully recorded, yet the file still offered no convincing explanation for what had happened to him. Over the years, Detective Chen had returned to Harold's file whenever she encountered cases that seemed to resist solution despite careful investigation. The file had become a touchstone for her, a reminder that police work sometimes involved accepting mystery rather than solving it. acknowledging the limits of investigation while still maintaining the commitment to thorough and professional procedure. Tonight, as she sat in the quiet archives with Harold's file open before her, Detective Chun found herself thinking about the nature of disappearance itself. The city processed thousands of missing person reports each year, most of which were resolved within days or weeks as people returned from unexpected trips or emerged from personal crises that had temporarily disrupted their normal routines. But a small percentage of these cases resisted resolution, becoming part of the permanent collection of mysteries that the city carried forward from one generation to the next. These unsolved disappearances created a hidden geography within the urban landscape, places where people had last been seen before vanishing into circumstances that remained forever unknown. Harold's evening route had become one of these places, a path through the downtown district that continued to exist physically while carrying the memory of someone who had walked it faithfully until the night he simply didn't return home. The route remained available to anyone who wanted to follow it, but it had been transformed by Harold's absence into something more than just a collection of streets and sidewalks. Detective Chun closed Harold's file and returned it to its place in the cabinet. But she remained in the archives for several more hours, moving quietly through the rows of shelving that contained the city's accumulated encounters with mystery and crime. Each file represented someone's story, carefully documented and preserved even when that story lacked a satisfying conclusion. The archives themselves had become a kind of monument to the persistence of human mystery, a place where the city's inability to explain certain events was transformed into a different kind of knowledge. Here, in these climate-controlled rooms beneath the police station, the questions that could not be answered were given the same careful attention as the cases that had been solved completely. As the night deepened around the building above, Detective Chun found herself walking through the archives with the same measured pace that Harold had once brought to his evening journey through the downtown district. There was something peaceful about moving through these rows of documented mystery, something that connected her to all the people whose stories rested in these files and all the officers who had worked to understand what had happened to them. The archives would be here tomorrow night and the night after that, maintaining their quiet vigil over the city's unsolved mysteries. Harold's file would remain in its appointed place, waiting for the day when new information might finally explain what had happened to a man who had simply stepped out for his evening walk and never returned home. But until that day arrived, if it ever did, Harold's disappearance would continue to exist as a reminder that the city, for all its lights and activity and ceaseless documentation, still contained spaces where people could vanish as completely as if they had been absorbed into the darkness itself. The fluorescent lights hummed their quiet song above the shelves, maintaining their steady illumination over files that contained stories both solved and unsolved, questions both answered and eternally open. In this place, mystery and documentation existed side by side, creating a strange kind of peace that seemed appropriate to the late hour and the weight of all the stories that surrounded Detective Chun as she finally made her way toward the stairs that would carry her back to the world above. Asterisk. The typewriter keys struck paper with mechanical precision, each letter forming words that would outlast the hands that created them. In the report room on the second floor of Central Station, Officer Margaret Reeves maintained the same careful rhythm she had perfected over 12 years of night shifts, transforming the chaos of human conflict into orderly rows of documentation that would find their way into the archives below. The report she was typing tonight concerned an incident from earlier in the evening, a domestic disturbance call that had brought officers to a small apartment on Elm Street, where neighbors had heard raised voices and the sound of something breaking. By the time the responding officers arrived, the apartment had fallen silent, its occupants claiming that nothing unusual had occurred. and that any noise the neighbors might have heard was probably from the television. Officer Reeves had learned to read between the lines of such reports, to understand the weight of what was not said as much as what was carefully documented. The responding officers had noted that Mrs. Catherine Walsh appeared nervous during their brief conversation, that she kept glancing toward the kitchen where her husband sat at a small table with his back turned toward the front door. They had observed a fresh scratch on the woman's left cheek and noticed that she favored her right arm when she gestured during their conversation, but none of these observations could be transformed into charges or arrests without Mrs. Walsh's cooperation, and she had insisted repeatedly that everything was fine, that she had simply dropped a dish while washing up after dinner, and that her husband had raised his voice at the television during a particularly frustrating moment in the baseball game they were watching. The officers had left their business cards and reminded Mrs. Walsh that help was available if she ever needed it, but they could do nothing more than document what they had observed and file their report in the system that tracked such incidents across the city. Officer Reeves typed their observations with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to every report, knowing that this documentation might someday become important if Mrs. Walsh ever decided to seek help or if the situation escalated beyond what could be contained within the walls of that small apartment. Asterisk. The report room maintained its own rhythm during the night shift, a steady flow of documentation that continued even when the city seemed to sleep. Officers arrived throughout the evening to file their reports, each one adding new entries to the permanent record of the city's ongoing encounter with crime and conflict. Some reports described dramatic events that would make headlines in the morning newspapers, but most documented smaller incidents that would be noted and filed without attracting public attention. Officer Reeves had typed thousands of such reports during her years on the night shift, each one representing someone's worst moment or most difficult hour. She had documented domestic disputes and traffic accidents, petty thefts and public disturbances, creating a paper trail that tracked the city's daily struggles with the complications of human behavior. The filing system that organized these reports reflected decades of institutional memory about how to categorize and store the endless variety of incidents that police officers encountered. Domestic disturbances were filed under a numerical code that distinguished them from other types of calls, with subcategories that noted whether weapons were involved, whether arrests were made, and whether children were present in the home. Each report became part of a larger pattern that emerged only when viewed across months or years of accumulated documentation. Individual incidents that seemed random or isolated when they occurred often revealed themselves to be part of ongoing situations that required sustained attention from social services, the courts, or community organizations that worked to address the underlying causes of repeated conflicts. Mrs. Walsh's name had appeared in police reports 3 times during the past 18 months, each incident following a similar pattern of neighbor complaints, police response, and denials that anything serious had occurred. Officer Reeves noted this pattern in her report, adding a recommendation that the case be reviewed by the Domestic Violence Unit for possible intervention strategies that might help Mrs. Walsh access resources if she chose to seek them. The process of writing police reports required a particular kind of attention to language and detail. Officers learned to describe events in terms that would be clear to prosecutors, judges, and juries who had not witnessed the incidents themselves. Every observation had to be grounded in specific facts that could be verified and defended. Every conclusion supported by evidence that could be presented in court if necessary. Officer Reeves had developed her own style of report writing over the years, an approach that balanced official requirements with an understanding of how these documents would be read and used by other people within the criminal justice system. She included enough detail to paint a clear picture of what had occurred, but avoided speculation or interpretation that might compromise the factual integrity of the documentation. The reports she typed became part of the city's permanent memory, stored in filing systems that stretched back decades and forward into an indefinite future. Some reports would be referenced frequently during ongoing investigations or court proceedings, while others would be filed away and never accessed again unless someone specifically searched for information about a particular incident or addressed. The weight of this responsibility had grown on Officer Reeves over the years, the understanding that her careful documentation might someday become the only record of events that had profoundly affected the people involved. She typed each report with the knowledge that someone's safety, freedom, or reputation might eventually depend on the accuracy and completeness of the words she was putting on paper. The report room itself reflected the institutional commitment to documentation that characterized modern police work. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates and case numbers that provided a chronological record of the city's encounters with crime. Typewriters sat at individual workstations, each one maintained and serviced regularly to ensure that the documentation process could continue without interruption. During busy periods, multiple officers would work simultaneously in the report room, the sound of their typing creating a mechanical symphony that spoke to the volume of incidents that required official documentation. Even during quieter hours, like tonight, the room maintained its sense of purpose and urgency, a place where the events of the day were transformed into the permanent record that would outlast the memories of everyone involved. Officer Reeves finished Mrs. Walsh's report and inserted a fresh sheet of paper into her typewriter, preparing to document the next incident that required attention. The stack of handwritten notes beside her represented several hours of work, each incident waiting to be transformed from preliminary observations into official documentation that would become part of the city's archives. The next report concerned a break-in at Henderson's hardware store on Oak Street, where the owner had arrived that morning to find his front window broken and several items missing from the display area. Mr. Henderson had provided a detailed list of the stolen merchandise, mostly small hand tools and electrical supplies that could be easily carried and quickly sold. The investigating officer had noted that this was the third break-in at Henderson's store during the past 6 months, each incident following a similar pattern of broken glass and stolen goods that suggested the work of someone familiar with the layout and inventory of the store. The officer had recommended increased patrol coverage for the block during late evening hours when most businesses were closed and the area became relatively deserted. Officer Reeves typed Mr. Henderson's statement with particular attention to his description of the stolen items and their estimated value. Property crimes like this one generated reports that would be forwarded to the detective division for follow-up investigation, and the quality of the initial documentation often determined whether investigators would have enough information to pursue meaningful leads. Mr. Henderson had expressed frustration during his interview with the investigating officer, noting that he had installed better locks and improved lighting around his store after the previous break-ins, but that these measures had not prevented the latest incident. He worried that the repeated thefts were affecting his ability to maintain adequate inventory and serve his regular customers, especially since he operated on narrow profit margins that made it difficult to absorb the cost of stolen merchandise. The officer's report included a recommendation that Mr. Henderson be contacted by the Crime Prevention Unit, which could provide advice about additional security measures that might deter future break-ins. The report also noted that several other businesses on Oak Street had experienced similar incidents during recent months, suggesting that the area might be targeted by individuals or groups who had identified it as vulnerable to this type of crime. As Officer Reeves typed these details, she reflected on how police reports captured not just the immediate facts of criminal incidents, but also their broader impact on the community. Mr. Henderson's frustration represented the experience of many small business owners who found themselves repeatedly victimized by crimes that seemed minor to outside observers, but which had serious cumulative effects on their ability to operate successfully. The documentation process required officers to balance multiple perspectives and concerns, recording not just what had happened, but also how it had affected the people involved, and what steps might be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. Each report became a small piece in the larger puzzle of understanding how crime affected the daily life of the city, and how law enforcement could most effectively respond to ongoing challenges. Officer Reeves had learned to appreciate the complexity of this documentation process during her years in the report room. What appeared to be simple clerical work actually required a deep understanding of how the criminal justice system functioned and how different types of information would be used by investigators, prosecutors, and social service agencies. The language used in police reports had evolved over decades to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Reports needed to be clear enough for civilians to understand, but precise enough to meet legal standards for evidence and testimony. They had to provide sufficient detail for follow-up investigation while avoiding speculation or conclusions that exceeded the scope of what officers had actually observed. Officer Reeves had developed her own techniques for achieving this balance, drawing on training materials and senior officers' guidance to create reports that served their intended purposes effectively. She had learned to distinguish between facts that could be documented with certainty and impressions that might be important but which required different language to avoid creating legal complications. Third report in her stack concerned a noise complaint that had been filed by residents of an apartment building on Maple Street. Multiple tenants had called the police to report loud music and shouting coming from a unit on the second floor, where a party appeared to be continuing well past the city's noise ordinance limits. The responding officers had spoken to the apartment's tenant, Mr. James Morrison, who had been cooperative in reducing the volume of his stereo and asking his guests to move their conversation indoors. No citations had been issued, and the situation had been resolved through discussion and voluntary compliance with the noise regulations. Officer Reeves noted that this was Mr. Morrison's first appearance in police reports, suggesting that the incident represented an isolated lapse in judgment rather than a pattern of disruptive behavior. The report included a note that neighboring tenants had expressed appreciation for the quick police response and that the building's superintendent had been informed of the situation for his own records. Cases like Mr. Morrison's represented the majority of police work that occurred during typical night shifts, minor conflicts and misunderstandings that could be resolved through communication and reasonable enforcement of existing regulations. These incidents rarely attracted public attention or media coverage, but they formed a foundation of community policing efforts that helped maintain the quality of life that residents expected in their neighborhoods. The documentation of such incidents served multiple purposes beyond creating an official record of police activity. Reports about noise complaints, minor disputes, and quality of life issues helped supervisors understand how officers were spending their time and which neighborhoods required additional attention or resources. Accumulated data from these reports also provided insights into seasonal patterns, weekend trends, and other factors that influenced the volume and types of calls that police received. This information informed decisions about shift schedules, patrol assignments, and community outreach programs that could address problems before they required police intervention. Officer Reeves had observed these patterns during her years of typing police reports, noting how certain types of incidents clustered around particular times of year or days of the week. Domestic disturbances often increased during holiday periods, when family tensions were heightened by financial stress and forced social interactions. Property crimes showed seasonal variations that reflected changes in daylight hours and the presence of students in neighborhoods near the university. Understanding these patterns had made Officer Reeves more effective in her role of documenting police activity, allowing her to recognize when individual incidents were part of larger trends that might require coordinated responses from multiple units within the department. Her reports often included observations about such patterns when they seemed relevant to ongoing prevention or investigation. Efforts. The fourth report in her stack described a traffic accident that had occurred during the afternoon rush hour at the intersection of Main Street and River Avenue. Two vehicles had collided when one driver failed to yield the right-of-way while making a left turn, resulting in moderate damage to both cars, but no serious injuries to the people involved. The investigating officer had determined that the driver making the left turn was at fault and had issued a citation for failure to yield. Both drivers had been cooperative during the investigation, and their insurance companies had been notified to handle the property damage claims that would result from the accident. Officer Reeves typed the accident report with particular attention to the diagram that showed the positions of the vehicles before and after the collision. These diagrams became important evidence if insurance disputes arose, or if either party decided to contest the citation in court. The investigating officer had measured skid marks, photographed the damage to both vehicles, and interviewed witnesses who had observed the accident from nearby locations. Traffic accident reports required a different kind of precision than other types of police documentation, since they often involved questions of civil liability that could result in significant financial consequences for the people involved. Officers who investigated accidents needed to document not just what had happened, but also the specific violations of traffic laws that had caused the collision. The intersection where this accident had occurred was noted in the report as a location where several similar incidents had happened during recent months. The investigating officer had recommended that the traffic engineering department review the signal timing and signage at this intersection to determine whether changes might reduce the likelihood of future accidents. These recommendations represented an important function of police report writing that extended beyond documenting individual incidents to identifying systemic issues that contributed to repeated problems in particular locations. The accumulated data from traffic accident reports helped city planners and engineers understand where infrastructure improvements might enhance public safety. Officer Reeves had typed hundreds of traffic accident reports during her tenure in the report room, each one representing someone's difficult day, but also contributing to a larger understanding of how traffic patterns and road design affected public safety throughout the city. She had learned to appreciate how individual reports became part of broader efforts to improve transportation systems and reduce the risk of future accidents. Final report in her current stack concerned a shoplifting incident at Woolworth's department store, where security personnel had apprehended a teenager attempting to leave the store with several items of clothing that she had not purchased. The store manager had decided not to press charges against the girl, who was a first-time offender and appeared to be acting on a dare from friends rather than out of financial necessity. The responding officer had contacted the girl's parents, who had come to the store to retrieve their daughter, and had agreed to pay for the merchandise she had attempted to steal. The incident had been resolved without formal charges, but the report documented the occurrence for future reference in case the girl was involved in similar incidents. Officer Reeves noted that this type of resolution represented the kind of community policing approach that often proved more effective than formal prosecution in addressing minor crimes committed by young people. The involvement of the girl's parents and the store manager's willingness to accept restitution had created an educational opportunity that might prevent future incidents more effectively than criminal penalties. The documentation of such incidents served important purposes, even when no formal charges were filed. The reports created a record that could be referenced if the same individual was involved in future incidents, allowing officers and prosecutors to distinguish between first-time mistakes and patterns of criminal behavior that required more serious intervention. As Officer Reeves completed this report and removed the final sheet of paper from her typewriter, she reflected on the evening's work and the variety of human situations that had required police attention and documentation. Each report represented someone's encounter with conflict, crisis, or criminal behavior, but also demonstrated the ways that community institutions could respond to such challenges with approaches that balanced accountability with compassion. The stack of completed reports would be filed in the appropriate cabinets and forwarded to the relevant departments for follow-up action. Some would generate additional investigation, while others would simply become part of the permanent record that tracked the city's ongoing efforts to maintain public safety and order. Report room would continue its function throughout the night and into the following day. As new incidents occurred and new officers arrived to document their observations and recommendations, the steady rhythm of typewriter keys and filing cabinet drawers created a mechanical heartbeat that measured the city's pulse through its encounters with the complexities of human behavior. Officer Reeves gathered her completed reports and prepared to distribute them according to the filing system that organized the department's documentation efforts. Each report would find its designated place in the larger archive of police activity, joining thousands of other documents that recorded the city's daily struggle to understand and respond to crime and conflict. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly above the workstations, maintaining their steady illumination over a process that continued regardless of the hour or the season. In this room, the events of each day were transformed into permanent records that would outlast the memories of everyone involved, creating an institutional memory that preserved both the facts of what had occurred and the efforts that had been made to address each situation appropriately. The city slept fitfully around the police station, its streets carrying the occasional vehicle or pedestrian through neighborhoods where most windows were dark and most conflicts had been temporarily resolved. But in the report room, the work of documentation continued, creating the careful record that would allow future officers and investigators to understand what had happened during this particular night and how the community had responded to the challenges it faced. Officer Reeves turned off her typewriter and cleared her workstation, preparing for the next shift's arrival and the continuation of the documentation process that never truly ended. The reports she had completed would begin their journey through the filing system, eventually finding their way to the archives where they would join the accumulated memory of the city's ongoing encounter with the mysteries and conflicts that emerged from the complexity of human life. The sub-basement of Central Station existed in perpetual twilight, its concrete walls lined with filing cabinets that stretched back into shadows, where the overhead lighting failed to reach completely. Here, 3 levels below the active police station, the oldest records rested in climate-controlled silence, their metal containers arranged in rows that seemed to extend infinitely into the building's forgotten depths. Archivist Helen Morse had worked in these depths for 23 years, maintaining the careful order that preserved decades of police documentation in conditions that would protect them from the deterioration that eventually claimed all paper records. Her domain included files dating back to the 1920s, when the city had first implemented systematic record-keeping procedures that created permanent documentation for every significant police incident. The air in the sub-basement moved slowly, circulated by machinery that maintained the precise temperature and humidity levels necessary to preserve paper, ink, and photographs across generations of storage. The silence was profound but not complete, broken occasionally by the distant hum of climate control systems and the soft whisper of Helen's footsteps as she moved between the towering rows of cabinets. Tonight, Helen was conducting her monthly inventory of Section G, which contained criminal investigation files from the 1940s and early 1950s. These cases had been transferred to long-term storage after their active investigation periods had ended, but they remained accessible to researchers, journalists, and occasionally to investigators working on cases that might have connections to these older events. The first cabinet in Section G bore the label 1947-1948. Homicide cases 001 to 125. Its metal surface showing the patina of age, but maintaining the structural integrity that had protected its contents for more than 3 decades. Helen opened the drawer with the careful attention that characterized all her movements in the archives, aware that these files contained some of the most serious crimes that the city had ever documented. Case File 047 contained the investigation records for a homicide that had occurred in February 1948, when the body of Margaret Thompson had been discovered in her apartment on Elm Street by her landlord, who had become concerned when she failed to pay her rent for 2 consecutive months. The initial police report, typed on paper that had yellowed slightly despite the controlled storage conditions, described a scene that had puzzled investigators for months without yielding a satisfactory resolution. Detective Frank Morrison, no relation to the Morrison who had investigated Harold Hartwell's disappearance 14 years later, had spent 6 months pursuing leads in Margaret Thompson's case before it was transferred to the inactive file. His reports documented a meticulous investigation that had revealed very little about why a 34-year-old seamstress had been found dead in her locked apartment with no obvious signs of violence or struggle. The medical examiner had been unable to determine a definitive cause of death, noting only that Miss Thompson appeared to have died peacefully in her sleep sometime during the final week of December 1947. Her body had been discovered in her bed, dressed in a nightgown and positioned as if she had simply laid down for the evening and never awakened. What made the case unusual was not the manner of Miss Thompson's death, which could have been attributed to any number of natural causes, but the circumstances that surrounded her final weeks. Detective Morrison's investigation had revealed that Miss Thompson had been living under an assumed name, having arrived in the city 3 years earlier with identification documents that appeared to be falsified and a personal history that could not be verified through conventional means. The landlord, Mr. Samuel Chun, had described Miss Thompson as a model tenant who paid her rent promptly each month and caused no disturbances in the building. She worked as a seamstress for several local businesses, taking on piecework that she completed in her apartment during evening hours. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who kept regular hours and maintained polite but distant relationships with the other residents of the building. Detective Morrison had interviewed Miss Thompson's employer, Mrs. Ruth Henderson, who operated a small dressmaking business from a shop on Main Street. Mrs. Henderson had hired Miss Thompson based on her obvious skill with needle and thread, asking few questions about her background since qualified seamstresses were difficult to find during the post-war period when many women had left such work for other opportunities. Miss Thompson had been reliable and skilled, completing her assigned work with exceptional attention to detail and quality. Mrs. Henderson had been pleased with her employees' performance and had been considering offering her additional responsibilities when she learned of Miss Thompson's death from Detective Morrison's initial inquiry. The investigation had revealed that Miss Thompson maintained no bank accounts under her assumed name, apparently conducting all her financial affairs in cash. Her apartment contained no personal correspondence, no photographs, and no documents that might have revealed information about her life before arriving in the city. She owned only the basic necessities required for daily life and the tools of her trade. As a seamstress, Detective Morrison had spent considerable effort attempting to trace Miss Thompson's real identity, working with federal authorities who had access to immigration records and other documentation that might have explained how someone could establish a new life with falsified papers. These inquiries had yielded no useful information, suggesting that Miss Thompson had been either exceptionally skilled at concealing her past or that her original identity had been erased by circumstances that remained unknown. The detectives' reports included detailed descriptions of Miss Thompson's apartment as it had been found after her death. The space was neat and orderly, suggesting that she had maintained her regular routine until the end of her life. Her sewing equipment was clean and properly stored, and her few personal belongings were arranged with the same careful attention to detail that characterized her professional work. What struck Detective Morrison as particularly significant was the complete absence of any evidence that Miss Thompson had been preparing for death or expecting any change in her circumstances. Her rent was current, her work assignments were up to date, and she had recently purchased fabric and other supplies that suggested ongoing projects and future plans. The case file included photographs of Miss Thompson's apartment, black and white images that captured the stark simplicity of a life lived without apparent connections to family, friends, or community organizations. The photograph showed a woman who had created a functional existence within carefully maintained boundaries, neither seeking attention nor avoiding contact with others, but simply maintaining the minimum level of social interaction necessary for survival in an urban environment. Asterisk. Helen Morse had read Miss Thompson's file many times during her years in the archives, drawn by the mystery of a woman who had successfully created a new identity, but had taken the secrets of her original life with her into death. The case represented one of many unsolved mysteries that rested in the archives, each one documenting the city's encounter with individuals whose personal histories remained forever unknown. Next file in the cabinet contained the investigation records for a burglary case that had occurred during the same period, when a series of break-ins had targeted apartments in the downtown district during late evening hours. The perpetrator had demonstrated unusual skill in entering locked buildings without causing obvious damage, suggesting either professional experience or exceptional natural ability in bypassing standard security measures. Detective William Chun, who had worked the burglary case, had documented 17 separate incidents over a 4-month period, each following a similar pattern of entry through windows or doors that showed no signs of forced access. The burglar had taken small valuable items that could be easily carried and quickly sold, avoiding larger objects that might have been traced or that would have required transportation assistance. What made this case particularly puzzling was the burglar's apparent knowledge of which apartments contained items worth stealing and which were occupied by residents who maintained regular schedules that could be predicted with reasonable accuracy. Detective Chun's investigation had suggested that the perpetrator possessed detailed information about the daily routines of potential victims, information that would have required systematic observation over extended periods. The investigation had eventually identified a suspect, Robert Mills, who worked as a maintenance person for several apartment buildings in the affected area. Mills had access to master keys and detailed knowledge of which tenants were likely to be absent during particular hours, making him an obvious person of interest when the pattern of burglaries became clear. However, Mills had disappeared from the city before Detective Chun could arrange for his arrest, apparently aware that his activities had attracted police attention. The case remained open for several months while investigators attempted to locate Mills, but he was never found and the burglaries ceased after his departure. Detective Chun's final report noted that Mills had left behind few personal possessions and no forwarding address, suggesting that he had been prepared to abandon his life in the city if his criminal activities were discovered. The investigation had revealed that Mills had been using a false name and had no verifiable employment history prior to his arrival in the city 18 months before the burglaries began. Helen had often noticed how certain cases from this period shared common elements of assumed identities, false documentation, and individuals who seemed to move through the city without leaving permanent traces of their presence. The post-war period had created opportunities for people to reinvent themselves, whether for legitimate reasons related to wartime displacement or for purposes connected to criminal activity. The third file in her current inventory concerned a missing person case that had never been resolved despite extensive investigation by multiple detectives over several years. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh had vanished from her home on Oak Street in March 1949, leaving behind a husband and 2 young children, but no explanation for her sudden departure. Detective James Rodriguez had interviewed Mr. Walsh extensively, documenting a marriage that appeared stable and a family situation that offered no obvious motives for Mrs. Walsh's disappearance. Mr. Walsh described his wife as devoted to their children and committed to their life together, making her absence seem completely out of character for the woman he had known for 8 years of marriage. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Walsh had withdrawn a small amount of money from their joint savings account on the day of her disappearance, but not enough to suggest that she had been planning an extended absence or a permanent departure. She had taken no clothing beyond what she was wearing when she left the house, and she had left behind personal items that Mr. Walsh insisted she would never have abandoned voluntarily. Detective Rodriguez had pursued various theories about what might have happened to Mrs. Walsh, including the possibility that she had been the victim of foul play, or that she had suffered some form of amnesia or mental breakdown that had caused her to wander away from her familiar surroundings. None of these theories had been supported by evidence sufficient to justify formal conclusions. The case file documented interviews with Mrs. Walsh's family members, friends, and neighbors, all of whom described her as a responsible mother and wife who had shown no signs of distress or dissatisfaction in the weeks preceding her disappearance. Her sister, Mrs. Janet Morrison, had been particularly insistent that Dorothy would never have left her children voluntarily. Regardless of what difficulties she might have been experiencing, Mrs. Morrison had suggested that Dorothy might have been kidnapped or that she had suffered an accident that had prevented her from returning home. But searches of the surrounding area had yielded no evidence to support either possibility. The case had remained active for 3 years before being transferred to the inactive files, where it joined other disappearances that had resisted solution despite thorough investigation. Helen had learned that Mr. Walsh had eventually moved away from the city with his children, apparently unable to continue living in the home where his wife's absence created a constant reminder of unanswered questions. The house on Oak Street had been sold to a new family who had no knowledge of the mystery that had occurred within its walls, allowing the building to acquire new associations that gradually replaced the memory of Mrs. Walsh's unexplained departure. As Helen continued her inventory of Section G, she encountered file after file documenting cases that had challenged investigators, ability to find satisfactory explanations for criminal events. The 1940s and early 1950s had been a period of significant social transition, when wartime disruptions had created opportunities for criminal activity, and when large numbers of people had been displaced from their original communities and identities. Many of the unsolved cases from this period involved individuals who seemed to exist on the margins of conventional society. People who had adopted new identities or who had arrived in the city without verifiable personal histories. The post-war economic boom had created opportunities for such individuals to establish themselves in new communities, but it had also made it easier for those with criminal intentions to disappear when their activities attracted unwanted attention. Detective Morrison's files included several cases involving confidence schemes that had targeted elderly residents who had accumulated savings during the war years but who lacked experience with the sophisticated fraud techniques that some criminals had developed. These cases often involved perpetrators who established themselves in the community over extended periods, building trust and relationships that allowed them to access their victims' financial resources before disappearing without trace. One such case involved a man calling himself Thomas Anderson, who had presented himself as an investment advisor, specializing in government securities and other conservative investments that would appeal to cautious savers. Anderson had rented an office on Main Street and had advertised his services in the local newspaper, gradually building a client base of retirees and other residents who were attracted by his professional appearance and apparently extensive knowledge of financial markets. Over a period of 8 months, Anderson had collected more than $15,000 from clients who had entrusted him with their savings for investment in securities that he claimed would provide steady returns with minimal risk. When several clients had attempted to contact Anderson to inquire about their investments, they had discovered that his office had been abandoned and that no records remained of their financial arrangements with him. Detective Shun's investigation had revealed that Anderson's office lease had been paid in cash for 6 months in advance, and that he had provided false references and identification when establishing his business presence in the city. The investment documents he had provided to clients were sophisticated forgeries that had been created with sufficient skill to deceive people who lacked specialized knowledge of financial instruments. The case had attracted attention from federal investigators who were tracking similar schemes in other cities. But Anderson was never located, and the money he had collected was never recovered. His victims were left with worthless documents and the knowledge that their careful savings had been lost to someone who had exploited their trust and their desire for financial security during uncertain times. Helen had observed that cases like Anderson's represented a particular type of criminal activity that had flourished during periods of social transition, when traditional community structures had been disrupted and when people were more likely to trust strangers who presented themselves with apparent credentials and professional competence. The post-war period had created ideal conditions for such schemes, as people sought to rebuild their lives and plan for the future in an environment where many traditional institutions had been weakened or changed. The archives contain dozens of similar cases from this period, each one documenting how criminals had exploited the social disruptions of wartime to create opportunities for fraud, theft, and other crimes that depended on the breakdown of normal community oversight and verification procedures. These cases had often been difficult to investigate because the perpetrators had been skilled at creating false identities and because their victims had often been reluctant to report crimes that made them feel foolish or naive. Detective Rodriguez had worked several cases involving door-to-door salesmen who had used high-pressure tactics to sell overpriced or worthless merchandise to homeowners who had been isolated from normal commercial networks by wartime. rationing and restrictions. These criminals had often targeted elderly residents or women whose husbands were serving in the military, taking advantage of people who were vulnerable to manipulation and who had limited experience with protecting themselves from sophisticated sales techniques. One case had involved a man calling himself David Mitchell, who had sold household appliances that he claimed were made from surplus military materials that offered superior quality and durability compared to civilian products. Mitchell had demonstrated exceptional skill in identifying potential victims and in adapting his sales presentation to appeal to their specific concerns and desires. Detective Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that Mitchell's appliances were actually defective units that had been rejected by legitimate manufacturers and refurbished with cosmetic improvements that concealed their functional problems. By the time customers discovered that their purchases were worthless, Mitchell had moved on to other neighborhoods or other cities, leaving behind only false contact information and worthless warranties. The case file documented Mitchell's techniques in detail, providing information that had been shared with other police departments to help them recognize and investigate similar schemes. Detective Rodriguez had noted that Mitchell's success depended largely on his ability to establish personal relationships with his victims, spending considerable time in conversation before introducing his sales presentation. This approach had allowed Mitchell to identify people who were lonely, worried about financial security, or eager to take advantage of what appeared to be exceptional bargains on necessary household items. His victims had often been people who had been isolated from normal social networks by wartime disruptions and who were grateful for the personal attention that Mitchell provided along with his sales pitch. Helen had learned to recognize patterns in these archival cases that reflected broader social conditions and historical circumstances that had influenced criminal activity during particular periods. The files from the 1940s and 1950s documented how major social disruptions had created opportunities for criminal exploitation, but they also revealed how law enforcement agencies had adapted their investigative techniques to address new types of crimes that had emerged from changing social conditions. As she continued her inventory work, Helen encountered files that documented the evolution of police investigative methods during this transitional period. The post-war years had seen significant improvements in forensic science, communication technology, and interagency cooperation that had enhanced law enforcement's ability to investigate complex cases that involved multiple jurisdictions or sophisticated criminal techniques. Detective Morrison's later cases showed evidence of these improvements, including the use of fingerprint analysis, improved photography techniques, and coordination with federal agencies that had developed specialized expertise in particular types of criminal activity. These advances had not solved all the mysteries that had accumulated in the archives, but they had provided investigators with tools that had not been available to earlier generations of police officers. The final section of Helen's current inventory included files from the early 1950s, when the city had begun to experience the social changes that would characterize the following decades. These cases reflected the beginning of suburbanization, increased automobile ownership, and other developments that had changed both the patterns of criminal activity and the methods required to investigate crimes effectively. Detective Chun's files from this period included several cases involving automobile theft, a crime that had become more common as car ownership had expanded beyond the wealthy families who had dominated vehicle ownership during earlier decades. The post-war economic boom had made automobiles accessible to middle-class families, creating new opportunities for criminals who specialized in stealing and reselling vehicles. One case had involved a sophisticated auto theft ring that had operated throughout the region, stealing cars from suburban neighborhoods and transporting them to other states, where they were sold to unsuspecting buyers through seemingly legitimate dealers. The investigation had required coordination between multiple police departments and federal agencies, representing a level of interagency cooperation that had been rare during earlier periods. Detective Chun had documented how the auto theft ring had used forged documentation and false identification to establish credible business fronts that had allowed them to sell stolen vehicles without arousing suspicion from buyers or regulatory authorities. The case had eventually been solved through the arrest of several ring members, but only after the criminals had successfully stolen and sold more than 50 vehicles over an 18-month period. Helen closed the final cabinet in Section G and updated her inventory records, noting which files had been accessed during recent months and which required conservation attention to prevent deterioration. The archives represented not just a collection of criminal cases, but a comprehensive record of how the city had encountered and responded to the challenges of crime and social change across several decades of growth and development. Each file in the archives contained stories that had once occupied the attention of investigators, prosecutors, and community members who had been directly affected by criminal activity. Many of these stories had been resolved through successful prosecutions or other satisfactory conclusions, but others remained forever incomplete, their mysteries preserved in climate-controlled silence alongside the documented facts that had been established through careful investigation. The sub-basement archives would continue to preserve these records for future generations of researchers and investigators who might someday find new ways to understand the unsolved cases, or who might discover connections between old crimes and new investigations. The files represented a form of institutional memory that transcended the limitations of individual human recall, creating a permanent record of the city's ongoing encounter with the complexities of criminal behavior. As Helen prepared to leave the archives for the evening, she reflected on the weight of responsibility that came with maintaining these records and ensuring their preservation for future access. The stories contained in these files represented real people who had experienced crime as victims, perpetrators, investigators, and community members affected by events that had disrupted their normal expectations of safety and order. The careful organization and preservation of these records ensured that their stories would not be lost to time, even when the people who had lived through these events were no longer available to share their memories and perspectives. In the climate-controlled silence of the sub-basement, the past maintained its presence through documentation that would outlast the buildings and institutions that had created it. The archives rested in darkness as Helen turned off the lighting systems and secured the entrance to the sub-basement storage areas. Above, the police station continued its 24-hour operations, responding to new incidents that would eventually generate their own files for preservation in these same storage areas. The cycle of documentation and preservation continued, creating an ever-growing record of how one city had struggled to understand and respond to the criminal challenges that emerged from the complexity of human behavior and social change. The old courthouse on Judicial Square had been abandoned for administrative use in 1973, when the city had constructed a modern facility that could accommodate the growing volume of legal proceedings and the technological requirements of contemporary court operations. But the original building remained standing, its neoclassical facade maintained as a historical landmark, while its interior spaces were gradually converted to storage and archive functions that preserved the physical remnants of the judicial process. Building maintenance supervisor Carl Hendricks had worked in the old courthouse for 47 years, beginning as a janitor in 1956 and eventually becoming responsible for the preservation and security of a structure that had witnessed thousands of legal proceedings since its construction in 1889. Building held memories in its wood and stone, echoes of trials and hearings that had determined the fates of people whose names were now recorded only in court, transcripts and newspaper archives. Main courtroom on the second floor remained largely unchanged from its original configuration, with wooden benches arranged in neat rows facing the judge's bench that had been carved from a single piece of oak by craftsmen who had understood that their work would outlast their own lifetimes. The room's tall windows filtered afternoon light through glass that had been installed before the First World War, creating patterns of illumination that shifted with the seasons and the time of day. Carl had unlocked this courtroom every morning for more than 4 decades, maintaining the cleaning and maintenance routines that preserved its appearance, even though no trials had been conducted here since the move to the new facility. The room retained its sense of solemn purpose, as if the accumulated weight of legal proceedings had become part of its physical structure, embedded in the wood and stone that had witnessed so many moments of judgment and resolution. The judge's bench bore the wear marks of countless gavels, small indentations in the wood where generations of judges had called proceedings to order and rendered decisions that had changed the lives of everyone present in the courtroom. Behind the bench, the wall displayed portraits of former Chief Justices, their painted faces observing the empty room with expressions that suggested the gravity of the responsibilities they had carried. During their years of service, Carl remembered many of the trials that had taken place in this courtroom. During his early years of employment, when he had cleaned the building each evening after the day's proceedings had concluded, he had mopped floors that had been walked by defendants, attorneys, witnesses, and family members who had come to observe the legal process that would determine outcomes for cases ranging from minor infractions to capital crimes. The trial had attracted significant public attention because Davidson had maintained his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence that had connected him to the robberies through fingerprint analysis, witness identification, and physical evidence that had been recovered from his apartment. The case had represented one of the first major criminal trials in the city to rely heavily on scientific evidence, establishing precedents for the use of forensic analysis in future prosecutions. Carl had observed the trial proceedings during his breaks, standing quietly in the back of the courtroom while attorneys presented their arguments and witnesses provided testimony that gradually constructed a narrative of Davidson's guilt or innocence. The defendant had sat at the defense table with apparent calm, taking notes and conferring with his attorney while the prosecution methodically presented evidence that seemed to establish his culpability beyond reasonable doubt. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges, a decision that had resulted in Davidson's sentencing to 25 years in the state penitentiary. Carl had been present in the courtroom when the verdict was announced, watching as Davidson's family members had wept quietly in the gallery while the judge had pronounced sentence with the formal language that transformed a human being into a number within the correctional system. The courtroom had also witnessed the trial of Margaret Chun in 1967, when she had been accused of embezzling funds from the insurance company, where she had worked as a bookkeeper for 15 years. The case had been particularly difficult because Chun had been a respected member of the community with no previous criminal record, making her alleged crime seem completely out of character for someone who had been trusted with significant financial responsibilities. Carl had cleaned the defendant's table each evening during the Kien trial, polishing wood that had been worn smooth by the hands of countless people who had faced judgment in this room. The case had been complicated by questions about Chun's mental state and the financial pressures that had apparently motivated her to steal money that she had used to pay for her mother's medical treatment during a prolonged illness. The trial had raised difficult questions about the relationship between financial desperation and criminal behavior, with the defense arguing that Chun's actions had been motivated by love for her dying mother rather than personal greed. The prosecution had countered that good intentions could not excuse criminal behavior and that Chun's position of trust had made her crimes particularly serious violations of community standards. The jury had convicted Chen of embezzlement but had recommended leniency in sentencing, a recommendation that the judge had followed by imposing a suspended sentence that allowed Chun to repay the stolen funds through community service rather than imprisonment. Carl had observed the sentencing hearing and had seen the relief on Chun's face when she had realized that she would not be separated from her family during her mother's final months of life. These trials had been part of a continuous stream of legal proceedings that had filled the courthouse with the drama of human conflict and the careful procedures designed to resolve disputes according to established principles of law and evidence. Carl had witnessed hundreds of such proceedings during his years of employment, each one representing someone's crisis, but also demonstrating the community's commitment to addressing criminal behavior through systematic and fair legal processes that the building's basement had housed the county jail until 1958, when overcrowding and outdated facilities had necessitated the construction of a new detention center that could meet modern standards for housing accused criminals while they awaited trial. The old jail cells remained in the basement, their iron bars and concrete walls preserved as historical exhibits that reminded visitors of the harsh conditions that had once characterized local criminal justice practices. Carl had responsibility for maintaining the basement areas, including the former jail cells that had once held defendants who could not afford bail or who had been denied release because of the serious nature of their alleged crimes. The cells measured 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete floors and walls that had been painted institutional green during some forgotten renovation project that had attempted to improve the appearance of fundamentally inhumane living conditions. Each cell had contained a simple cot, a wash basin, and a toilet that had provided the minimal amenities necessary for human survival during periods of pretrial detention that sometimes lasted for months while cases moved slowly through the legal system. The cells had been designed for temporary housing, but chronic overcrowding had often forced multiple defendants to share spaces that had been intended for single occupancy. The basement also contained record storage areas where court transcripts, evidence files, and other legal documents had been preserved in fireproof cabinets that protected important papers from the disasters that had periodically threatened public buildings. These storage areas had been expanded several times during Carl's tenure as the volume of legal documentation had grown. With the city's population and the increasing complexity of criminal cases, Carl had often worked alone in the basement during evening hours, filing documents and maintaining the environmental controls that preserved paper records in conditions that would prevent deterioration over extended periods. The basement had its own atmosphere, quieter and cooler than the upper floors, with the sense of weight that came from being surrounded by tons of stone and concrete that had been built to last for centuries. Former jail cells had housed many defendants whose cases had become part of the courthouse's institutional memory. People whose names were recorded in court records, but whose personal stories had faded from public consciousness as their trials had been concluded and their sentences had been served. Carl had cleaned these cells countless times during his early years, removing the evidence of human occupancy and preparing the spaces for new arrivals who would await their own encounters with the legal system. One cell had held Thomas Morrison during the winter of 1959. when he had been charged with assault following a barroom fight that had left another man hospitalized with serious injuries. Morrison had maintained his innocence, claiming that he had acted in self-defense when attacked by several men who had objected to comments he had made about local politics. The case had been complicated by conflicting witness testimony and by Morrison's reputation as someone who had been involved in several previous altercations. Carl had remembered Morrison as a quiet presence in the basement jail, someone who had spent his time reading books that his attorney had brought during visits and writing letters to family members, who had posted bail money that had eventually secured his release before trial. Morrison had been convicted of assault, but had received a suspended sentence that had allowed him to return to his job at the steel mill where he had worked for 23 years. Another cell had housed Patricia Walsh during the spring of 1961, when she had been arrested for check fraud after attempting to cash forged documents at several downtown banks. Walsh had been a newcomer to the city, having arrived from another state with credentials that had later proved to be falsified and a personal history that had contained significant gaps that investigators had been unable to explain satisfactorily. Carl had observed that Walsh had seemed more comfortable in the jail environment than most defendants, adapting quickly to the routines and restrictions of detention as if she had previous experience with institutional life. Her case had eventually been resolved through a plea agreement that had resulted in her deportation to her state of origin, where she had faced additional charges related to similar fraudulent activities. The third floor of the courthouse had contained the offices of the district attorney, the public defender, and various court clerks who had managed the administrative aspects of legal proceedings. These offices had been abandoned when the court system had moved to the new facility, but they remained largely intact with their original furnishings and equipment that documented the evolution of legal practice over several decades. Carl had maintained these offices throughout his tenure, dusting desks and filing cabinets that had contained the working papers of attorneys and clerks who had processed thousands of criminal cases. The offices had retained the atmosphere of active legal practice, with law books arranged on shelves and legal documents stored in filing systems that had been designed to provide quick access to information needed for ongoing cases. The district attorney's office had been the largest space on the third floor, with windows that overlooked Judicial Square and provided natural light for the legal research and case preparation that had been essential to successful prosecutions. The office had been occupied by several different district attorneys during Carl's years of employment, each one bringing different approaches to criminal justice, but all working within the same physical space that had shaped their daily routines and professional perspectives. District Attorney Robert Chun had occupied the office from 1962 to 1971, during a period when the city had experienced significant changes in both crime patterns and law enforcement techniques. Chun had been known for his methodical approach to case preparation and his commitment to ensuring that prosecutions were based on solid evidence rather than community pressure or political considerations. Carl had cleaned Chun's office each evening, maintaining the careful organization that the Petit district attorney had required for managing the complex caseload that had grown steadily during his tenure. The office had contained filing systems for active cases, reference materials for legal research, and communication equipment that had allowed Chun to coordinate with police investigators and other agencies involved in criminal justice activities. Chun had prosecuted many of the major criminal cases that had occurred during the 1960s, including several murder trials that had attracted regional attention and numerous fraud cases that had involved sophisticated schemes designed to exploit weaknesses in financial and commercial systems. His office had developed expertise in areas of criminal law that had been relatively new during this period, including cases involving organized crime and federal violations that had required coordination with agencies outside the local jurisdiction. The public defender's office had been located across the hall from the district attorney, creating a physical proximity that had reflected the adversarial nature of the legal system while facilitating the practical coordination necessary for efficient court operations. The public defender's office had been smaller and less well-equipped than the prosecutor's office, reflecting budget limitations that had affected the resources available for defending indigent clients. Public defender Sarah Morrison had served in this capacity from 1965 to 1973, providing legal representation for defendants who could not afford private attorneys. Morrison had been known for her thorough case preparation and her commitment to ensuring that all defendants received competent legal representation, regardless of their financial circumstances or the nature of the charges they faced. Carl had observed Morrison working late into the evening hours, preparing cases for defendants whose lives depended on the quality of legal representation they received from the public defender's office. The office had maintained files for hundreds of active cases, each one representing someone who had been accused of criminal behavior and who required skilled advocacy to navigate the complexities of the legal system. Morrison had handled many difficult cases during her tenure, including capital murder trials that had required extensive investigation and expert testimony to provide effective defense strategies. Her office had developed relationships with investigators, expert witnesses, and social service agencies that could provide resources needed to understand the circumstances that had led to criminal behavior and to develop sentencing recommendations that addressed underlying causes, rather than simply imposing punishment. The court clerk's office had maintained the official records for all legal proceedings, creating the permanent documentation that preserved the details of trials, hearings, and other judicial activities. The clerk's office had been responsible for scheduling court appearances, maintaining evidence custody, and providing administrative support for judges and attorneys who required access to case files and legal precedents. Carl had worked closely with the court clerk's staff during his years of employment, helping to maintain the filing systems and storage areas that contained the growing volume of legal documentation generated by active court operations. The clerk's office had evolved significantly during his tenure, adopting new technologies and procedures that had improved the efficiency and accuracy of record-keeping activities. The courthouse building had witnessed the gradual transformation of criminal justice practices from the relatively simple procedures of the early 20th century to the complex systems that had emerged by the 1970s. Carl had observed these changes through his daily contact with the people and processes that had occupied the building, seeing how advances in forensic science, communication technology, and legal theory had influenced the way criminal cases were investigated, prosecuted, and resolved. The building's architecture had both facilitated and constrained these changes, providing formal spaces that had emphasized the gravity of legal proceedings while sometimes limiting the flexibility needed to accommodate new approaches to criminal justice. The courtroom's fixed seating arrangements had worked well for traditional trial procedures but had been less suitable for newer approaches that emphasized rehabilitation and community involvement in addressing criminal behavior. Despite these limitations, the courthouse had successfully served the community's legal needs for more than 8 decades, providing a stable institutional foundation for the administration of justice, even as the specific practices and procedures had evolved significantly. The building had created a sense of continuity and permanence that had reinforced public confidence in the legal system while accommodating the changes necessary to address new types of criminal activity and changing social attitudes toward crime and punishment. As Carl prepared to retire from his position after 47 years of service, he reflected on the countless lives that had been affected by proceedings that had taken place within these walls. The building had provided the physical setting for moments of triumph and tragedy, justice and injustice, redemption and condemnation that had shaped the destinies of thousands of people who had appeared before its judges and juries. The empty courtroom still retained the echoes of all these proceedings, its wooden surfaces bearing the invisible imprints of hands that had gripped the witness stand, railed during difficult testimony, feet that had paced nervously while awaiting verdicts, and voices that had spoken words of confession, denial, forgiveness, and condemnation within these formal spaces designed to contain the full range of human moral complexity. The building would continue to serve the community in its new role as an archive and museum, preserving both the physical artifacts of past legal proceedings and the institutional memory of how one community had struggled to balance the competing demands of justice, mercy, and public safety across nearly a century of social change and legal evolution. In the gathering twilight, as Carl locked the courthouse doors for perhaps the final time in his long career, the building settled into the quiet that had become its permanent state since the active court operations had moved to newer facilities. The silence was profound but not empty, filled with the accumulated weight of all the human drama that had unfolded within these walls and all the attempts to understand and respond to the complexities of criminal behavior that had brought so many people through these doors in search of justice, mercy, or simply resolution to the conflicts that had disrupted their lives. The courthouse stood as a monument to the community's commitment to addressing crime through established legal procedures rather than vigilante justice or arbitrary punishment, representing a faith in institutional processes that had been tested repeatedly but had ultimately proven capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining essential principles of fairness and due process that protected both victims and defendants from the excesses that had characterized earlier approaches to criminal justice. Maple trees on Elm Street had grown tall enough to shade the entire block by 1975, their canopy creating a natural cathedral above the sidewalks, where children rode bicycles and elderly residents sat on porches during the warm months of summer. The neighborhood had developed its own rhythm over the decades, a pattern of daily life that connected families who had shared the same streets and concerns for generations, creating bonds that transcended the formal boundaries of property. Lines and family names. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson had lived at 247 Elm Street for 53 years, having moved into the small frame house as a young bride in 1922 when the neighborhood was still considered the outskirts of the city and when many of the lots remained vacant, waiting for families who could afford to build homes away from the crowded downtown districts. She had raised 4 children in that house, watched them grow up and move away to establish their own families, and had gradually become the unofficial historian of a street that had witnessed decades of births, deaths, marriages, and the smaller dramas that shaped community life. Eleanor's front porch provided an excellent vantage point for observing the daily rhythms of neighborhood activity, and she had developed the habit of sitting there each evening with her knitting, watching children play and neighbors return from work while keeping an informal account of the changes that marked the passage of time on Elm Street. Her memory contained stories about every house on the block, stories that connected past and present residents through shared experiences of joy and tragedy that had created the invisible threads binding the community together. The house at 251 Elm Street had been the center of neighborhood attention during the summer of 1963, when the Morrison family had experienced the kind of crisis that reminded everyone how quickly ordinary life could be disrupted by circumstances beyond individual control. James Morrison had been arrested for embezzlement at the bank where he had worked as a loan officer for 12 years, accused of stealing funds that he had allegedly used to cover gambling debts that had accumulated over several months of increasingly desperate attempts to recover losses from earlier wagers. Eleanor had watched from her porch as police officers had arrived at the Morrison house on a Tuesday evening, their presence attracting the attention of neighbors who had gathered on sidewalks and front yards to observe events that would be discussed in whispered conversations for months afterward. The Morrison family had been well regarded in the neighborhood, known for their regular church attendance, their well-maintained property, and their willingness to participate in community activities that brought residents together around shared concerns and celebrations. James Morrison's wife, Catherine, had been particularly active in neighborhood organizations, serving as treasurer for the Elm Street Garden Club and organizing annual block parties that had become important social events for families who valued the sense of community that such gatherings helped maintain. Her involvement in these activities had made the charges against her husband particularly shocking to neighbors who had trusted the Morrison family with financial responsibilities and social leadership. The arrest had created ripples of consequence that had extended far beyond the Morrison family itself, affecting relationships and activities throughout the neighborhood as residents had struggled to understand how someone they had known and trusted could have engaged in criminal behavior that violated both legal standards and community expectations. The Garden Club had been forced to conduct an emergency audit of its finances, while other organizations had quietly reviewed their own procedures for handling money and maintaining oversight of financial activities. Eleanor had observed the changes in neighborhood dynamics that had followed James Morrison's arrest and subsequent conviction, watching as some families had maintained their support for Catherine and her children, while others had gradually distanced themselves from associations that had become uncomfortable reminders of how quickly trust could be betrayed and community stability could be disrupted. Catherine Morrison had eventually been forced to sell the house on Elm Street, unable to maintain mortgage payments on a teacher's salary, while her husband served a 3-year sentence in the state penitentiary. The family had moved to a smaller apartment across town, effectively removing themselves from the neighborhood where their presence had become a source of ongoing tension and uncomfortable speculation about what signs of financial trouble their neighbors might have missed. The house had been purchased by the Chen family, recent immigrants who had been grateful to find affordable housing in a neighborhood with good schools and established community organizations. Eleanor had watched the Chen children adapt to their new environment, learning English through interactions with neighborhood playmates and gradually becoming integrated into the social networks that had previously excluded families who seemed too different from the established residents. The Chun family's arrival had created its own adjustments within the neighborhood, as longtime residents had struggled to balance their commitment to community inclusiveness with their uncertainty about how to relate to people whose cultural background and language created barriers to the easy communication that had characterized previous relationships among Elm Street families. Eleanor had made special efforts to welcome the Chun family, bringing cookies to their door and offering assistance with navigating local institutions and services that might be confusing to newcomers, unfamiliar with American bureaucratic procedures. Her gestures had been appreciated and reciprocated, leading to a friendship that had enriched both families while demonstrating to other neighbors that cultural differences could be overcome through patience and goodwill. The house at 239 Elm Street had its own connection to criminal events, though in this case the family had been victims rather than perpetrators of illegal activity. The Walsh family had experienced a break-in during the winter of 1969, when thieves had entered their home while they were visiting relatives for the holidays and had stolen jewelry, electronics, and other valuable items that represented years of careful saving and family heirlooms that could not be replaced. Eleanor had been the first to notice that something was wrong at the Walsh house, observing that newspapers had accumulated on the front porch for several days beyond the family's expected return date, and that lights that should have been controlled by automatic timers had remained dark throughout the evening hours. Her call to the police had led to the discovery of the break-in and had probably prevented additional theft that might have occurred if the criminals had realized that the house would remain unoccupied for an extended period. The investigation had revealed that the break-in was part of a series of similar crimes that had targeted families during holiday periods, when many people traveled to visit relatives or take vacations that left their homes vulnerable to criminals who had systematically identified properties that would be unoccupied during predictable time periods. The thieves had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of neighborhood patterns and family routines, suggesting either inside information or careful surveillance that had allowed them to select targets with minimal risk of discovery. The Walsh family had been devastated not just by the financial loss, but by the violation of privacy and security that had made their home feel unsafe. Even after the broken locks had been repaired and additional security measures had been installed, Mrs. Walsh had developed anxiety about leaving the house unattended and had begun to decline social invitations and family visits that required overnight absence from the neighborhood. The psychological impact of the crime had extended beyond the immediate victims to include neighbors who had realized their own vulnerability to similar attacks and who had begun to question the safety assumptions that had previously allowed them to feel secure in their homes and community. Several families had installed alarm systems and improved their door and window locks, while others had organized informal neighborhood watch activities that increased communication about suspicious activities and strangers who might be conducting surveillance of potential targets. Eleanor had participated in these neighborhood watch efforts, using her position on the front porch to maintain casual observation of street activities, while developing relationships with new residents and visitors who might otherwise have been viewed with unnecessary suspicion. Her long residence on Elm Street had given her knowledge of normal patterns that allowed her to distinguish between legitimate activities and behaviors that might indicate criminal intent. The house at 263 Elm Street had been affected by criminal activity in a different way, when the teenage son of the Rodriguez family had been arrested for vandalism and underage drinking, following an incident at the high school that had resulted in property damage and injuries to several students. The arrest had been particularly difficult for the Rodriguez family because they had worked hard to establish themselves as responsible members of the community and had been proud of their son's academic achievements and apparent commitment to staying out of trouble. Eleanor had known Miguel Rodriguez since he was a small child, watching him grow up on Elm Street and develop into a young man who had seemed destined for college and a successful career that would reflect well on his family's sacrifices and aspirations. The arrest had been shocking to neighbors who had viewed Miguel as a positive example of how immigrant families could achieve success through hard work and dedication to education and community involvement. The incident had occurred during a period when Miguel had been struggling with pressures related to academic performance, college applications, and his desire to fit in with classmates who came from more affluent backgrounds and who had access to opportunities that remained beyond his family's financial reach. The combination of stress and peer pressure had led to poor decisions that had resulted in consequences far more serious than Miguel had anticipated when he had agreed to participate in activities that had seemed relatively harmless at the time. Eleanor had observed the impact of Miguel's arrest on the Rodriguez family, watching as his parents had struggled with feelings of disappointment, embarrassment, and concern about how the incident would affect their son's future prospects and their own standing in the community. The family had been forced to use savings that had been intended for college expenses to pay for legal representation and court costs, while also dealing with the shame of having their private family crisis become public knowledge through court proceedings and newspaper coverage. The neighborhood response to Miguel's situation had been mixed, with some families expressing sympathy and support for the Rodriguez family, while others had been more judgmental about parenting practices and cultural factors that they believed might have contributed to the young man's problems. Eleanor had tried to bridge these different perspectives, organizing informal discussions that had allowed neighbors to express their concerns, while working toward understanding and mutual support rather than division and blame. Miguel had eventually been sentenced to community service and probation that had allowed him to complete high school and apply for college admission, though the criminal record had limited his options and had required him to work harder to overcome the disadvantages created by his legal troubles. The experience had been educational for the entire Rodriguez family, teaching them about American legal procedures while also demonstrating how community support could help families navigate difficult circumstances. The house at 255 Elm Street had been home to the Wilson family, whose daughter Patricia had been the victim of an attempted assault while walking home from her job at the downtown department store during the fall of 1971. The attack had occurred in broad daylight on a busy street, but the perpetrator had escaped before witnesses could provide detailed descriptions that might have led to his identification and arrest. Eleanor had been among the neighbors who had organized support for Patricia and her family during the difficult period following the attack, when the young woman had struggled with trauma symptoms that had affected her ability to work, sleep, and maintain the social relationships that had previously been important parts of her daily life. The neighborhood response had included practical assistance with transportation, meals, and household tasks, as well as emotional support that had helped Patricia begin the process of recovery. The incident had raised concerns about public safety that had affected the entire neighborhood, particularly families with teenage daughters who worked downtown, jobs that required them to walk through areas that might be dangerous during certain hours or under particular circumstances. Several families had adjusted their work schedules and transportation arrangements to provide additional protection for young women who might be vulnerable to similar attacks. The police investigation had been thorough but ultimately unsuccessful, despite efforts to identify patterns that might connect Patricia's attack to other incidents in the area and to develop leads through interviews with potential witnesses and examination of physical evidence from the crime scene. The lack of resolution had been frustrating for the Wilson family and had contributed to ongoing anxiety about whether the perpetrator might attempt additional attacks in the neighborhood. Eleanor had noted how criminal incidents created connections between families who might otherwise have remained only casual acquaintances, bringing people together around shared concerns about safety and community well-being while also revealing differences in attitudes and approaches to dealing with crisis situations. Some neighbors had responded to Patricia's attack by becoming more involved in neighborhood watch activities and advocacy for improved street lighting and police patrols, while others had simply become more cautious about their own activities and movements. The house at 271 Elm Street had been affected by criminal activity when Mr. Henry Chun, who was unrelated to the Chun family at 251 Elm Street, had been arrested for operating an illegal gambling operation in his basement during weekends when neighbors had noticed unusual numbers of visitors and late-night activities that had seemed inconsistent with normal residential use of the property. Eleanor had been aware of the increased traffic at the Chun house but had initially assumed that the family was hosting social gatherings or cultural events that reflected their background and traditions. The discovery that the activities involved illegal gambling had been surprising to neighbors, who had not suspected that their quiet residential street was being used for criminal enterprises that could have attracted police attention and potentially dangerous individuals to their neighborhood. The arrest had been the result of an investigation that had been initiated by complaints from residents of nearby streets who had been disturbed by traffic and noise associated with the gambling operation. Police surveillance had documented the scope of the illegal activities and had led to arrests of both Mr. Chun and several of his customers who had been present during the raid that had shut down the operation. The incident had created tension within the neighborhood about surveillance and reporting of suspicious activities, as some residents had felt that they should have been more observant and proactive about investigating unusual behaviors. while others had been concerned about the implications of neighborhood monitoring that might infringe on privacy and cultural practices that were different but not necessarily illegal. Eleanor had found herself in the position of mediating discussions about these issues, drawing on her long experience with neighborhood dynamics to help residents distinguish between legitimate concerns about criminal activity and prejudices or misunderstandings that might lead to unfair targeting of families whose customs and practices were unfamiliar to longtime residents. As Eleanor reflected on these various incidents and their impact on neighborhood life during her decades of residence on Elm Street, she recognized how criminal activity had served as a catalyst for both positive and negative changes in community relationships. Crisis situations had often brought out the best in neighbors who had rallied to support families in difficulty. But they had also revealed underlying tensions and prejudices that had sometimes damaged relationships and community cohesion. The neighborhood had evolved continuously during her years of residence, with new families arriving to replace those who had moved away and with changing social conditions that had influenced both the types of problems that families faced and the resources available for addressing criminal activity and its consequences. Eleanor's memory preserved the continuity that connected past and present residents through shared experiences of community life that had shaped the character of Elm Street. Her front porch had served as an informal community center where neighbors had gathered to share information, express concerns, and work through the challenges that had affected their shared environment. The conversations that had taken place on that porch had helped maintain the social bonds that had made Elm Street more than just a collection of individual households, creating a genuine neighborhood where people had felt responsible for each other's welfare and safety. The stories that Eleanor had witnessed and preserved represented the human dimension of criminal activity that was often lost in police reports and court proceedings that focused on legal procedures rather than the personal and community impacts of crime. Her perspective had encompassed both individual tragedies and community resilience, documenting how families and neighborhoods had adapted to challenges while maintaining their commitment to the values and relationships that had made their community worth preserving. As the sun set behind the maple trees that had grown tall during her decades of residence, Eleanor continued her evening routine of sitting on the porch and observing the activities that marked the end of another day on Elm Street. Children called in for dinner while adults returned from work, and elderly neighbors emerged for evening walks that maintained their connections to the community that had sustained them through decades of change and challenge. The neighborhood retained its essential character despite all the changes and difficulties it had experienced, testament to the strength of social bonds that had been tested by criminal activity but had ultimately proven capable of preserving the sense of community that had made Elm Street a place where families could build meaningful lives together. Eleanor's memory would preserve these stories for as long as she remained on her front porch, maintaining the continuity that connected past and present while preparing for whatever future challenges might test the resilience of this small corner of the larger city. The evening air carried the sounds of normal neighborhood life, children playing, adults conversing, and the gentle rustling of leaves that had witnessed decades of human drama, while providing the natural backdrop for community life that continued despite temporary disruptions and permanent changes. In this setting, the stories of crime and consequence became part of a larger narrative about how people created and maintained the social bonds that allowed them to survive and flourish together in an uncertain world. The police station settled into its nocturnal routine as the last of the day shift officers completed their reports and headed home to families and responsibilities that existed beyond the institutional walls that contained the city's response to criminal activity. The building took on a different character during the overnight hours, quieter but not empty, maintaining essential services while most of the community slept. through the darkness that both concealed and revealed the ongoing struggles between order and chaos that defined urban life. Sergeant Patricia Kowalski had worked the night shift for 14 years, arriving each evening at 10:30 to begin the 12-hour period that would carry her and her colleagues through the small hours, when the city's rhythm slowed but never completely stopped. She had chosen night duty because it offered the kind of police work that appealed to her temperament and professional interests, providing opportunities for thorough investigation and careful documentation that were often impossible during the busier periods when multiple incidents demanded immediate attention. The dispatcher's desk occupied a central position in the night shift operations, equipped with radio equipment that maintained communication with patrol officers and emergency response units that remained active throughout the city during the overnight hours. The radio traffic was lighter than during peak periods, but it maintained a steady flow of reports and requests that documented the ongoing need for police presence, even when most residents were safely behind locked doors. Dispatcher Maria Santos had operated the radio system during night shifts for 8 years, developing expertise in managing the communication needs of officers who worked alone or in pairs throughout a territory that seemed larger and more complex during the hours when backup might be farther away and response times might be extended by distance and reduced staffing levels. Her voice provided reassurance and coordination for officers who dealt with the unpredictable situations that emerged from the intersection of darkness, alcohol, domestic conflict, and the various other factors that created police incidents during overnight hours. The first call of Sergeant Kowalski's shift came at 11:45, when Officer Rodriguez requested assistance with a domestic disturbance at an apartment complex on Oak Street, where neighbors had reported shouting and the sound of furniture being moved or thrown. Such calls were common during night shifts, when family tensions that had built up during the day sometimes erupted into conflicts that required police intervention to prevent escalation into violence or property damage. Sergeant Kowalski responded to the scene along with Officer Chun, who had been patrolling the downtown district when the call was dispatched. The apartment building was typical of the older residential structures that housed many of the city's working families, with thin walls that made privacy difficult and shared hallways that carried sounds between units in ways that made personal conflicts into community concerns. The officers found that the disturbance had been resolved by the time of their arrival, with the apartment occupants claiming that they had been watching television at higher volume than usual, and that any sounds the neighbors might have heard had been from the program rather than from any domestic conflict. The explanation was plausible but incomplete, as both officers noted signs of tension and stress that suggested underlying problems that might resurface in future incidents. Sergeant Kowalski completed the incident report with careful attention to details that might be relevant if the apartment became the subject of additional calls for police service. Domestic disturbances often followed patterns that developed over time, with periods of relative calm alternating with crisis episodes that required increasingly serious intervention to protect the safety of all involved parties. The documentation process required officers to balance respect for privacy with recognition of their responsibility to identify situations that might pose ongoing risks to community safety. Night shift officers often developed expertise in reading the subtle signs that distinguish temporary conflicts from ongoing patterns of abuse that might require coordination with social service agencies and court systems that could provide protection and support for victims of domestic violence. Officer Chun returned to his patrol route while Sergeant Kowalski remained at the station to process the paperwork and maintain oversight of other activities that required supervisory attention during the overnight period. The station maintained skeleton staffing during night shifts, with officers assuming multiple responsibilities that were distributed among larger crews during busier periods. The next significant incident occurred at 1:15, when Officer Martinez reported that he had stopped a vehicle for speeding. and had discovered that the driver appeared to be under the influence of alcohol, despite claims that he had consumed only a small amount of wine with dinner several hours earlier. The traffic stop required field sobriety testing and eventual transportation to the station for formal breath analysis that would determine whether charges should be filed. Sergeant Kowalski supervised the booking process for the suspected drunk driver, ensuring that proper procedures were followed for evidence collection, rights advisement, and detention processing that would protect both the defendant's legal interests and the conscience integrity of the case if prosecution was pursued. Drunk driving cases required particular attention to procedural details because defense attorneys often challenged arrests based on technical violations of testing protocols or constitutional requirements. The suspect, Mr. David Wilson, had been cooperative during the arrest process, but had maintained his innocence regarding the degree of his impairment, claiming that medication he was taking for a medical condition might have affected his performance on the field sobriety tests. Such claims were common in drunk driving cases and required careful documentation that would allow prosecutors and defense attorneys to evaluate the strength of the evidence against the defendant. The breath analysis confirmed that Mr. Wilson's blood alcohol content exceeded the legal limit for driving, supporting the officer's decision to make the arrest, while also providing objective evidence that would be difficult to challenge in court proceedings. The results were carefully recorded and witnessed according to procedures that had been established to ensure the reliability of breath testing equipment and the accuracy of the measurements it produced. Mr. Wilson was processed for booking and placed in a holding cell where he would remain until morning, when arrangements could be made for bail or release, on his own recognizance depending on his criminal history and the policies of the court system regarding drunk driving offenses. The holding cells were designed for temporary detention of people who were too intoxicated to be safely released, but who did not pose significant risks that would require transfer to the county jail facility. Sergeant Kowalski completed the arrest paperwork while Officer Martinez returned to patrol duties, carrying portable radio equipment that would allow him to respond to additional calls while maintaining communication with the station dispatcher, who coordinated the activities of all officers working throughout the city during the night shift. The police station's overnight operations included responsibilities beyond responding to emergency calls, with officers using quieter periods to complete administrative tasks, conduct follow-up investigations, and maintain equipment and facilities that supported round-the-clock law enforcement activities. The night shift provided opportunities for thorough work on cases that required careful attention to detail rather than immediate response to crisis situations. Detective Williams used night shift hours to review case files and conduct telephone interviews with witnesses who were available during evening hours when they were home from work and more willing to spend time discussing their observations of criminal incidents. Many people preferred to speak with police officers during evening hours when they felt more secure and had more time to provide detailed information about what they had witnessed. Tonight, Detective Williams was working at a burglary case that had occurred the previous week when thieves had entered a small business through a rear window and had stolen cash from the register, along with several pieces of electronic equipment that could be easily resold. The investigation required interviews with employees, customers, and neighbors who might have observed suspicious activity in the area during the time period when the break-in had occurred. The case files were spread across Detective Williams' desk in the Detective Division office, which remained partially staffed during night shifts to provide investigative support for incidents that required immediate follow-up work. The Detective Division maintained its own rhythm during overnight hours, with investigators using the quiet environment to focus on complex cases that required sustained attention and careful analysis of evidence and witness statements. One of the witness interviews concerned Mrs. Helen Morrison, who lived in an apartment above the business that had been burglarized and who had reported hearing unusual sounds during the early morning hours when the break-in had apparently occurred. Mrs. Morrison had been reluctant to speak with police during the initial investigation because she was uncertain whether the sounds she had heard were related to criminal activity or to normal business operations that might have been conducted at unusual hours. Detective Williams had scheduled the telephone interview for the night shift when Mrs. Morrison would be home and when the conversation could be conducted without the time pressures that often limited the thoroughness of daytime interviews. The detective had learned that many witnesses provided more complete and accurate information when they were interviewed in comfortable settings during hours when they felt relaxed and unhurried. Mrs. Morrison's account provided several important details about the timing and nature of the sounds she had heard, information that helped establish the sequence of events during the burglary and that might be useful for identifying the perpetrators if they were apprehended in connection with similar crimes in the area. The interview also revealed that Mrs. Morrison had observed unfamiliar individuals in the neighborhood during recent weeks, observations that might be relevant to the investigation. The detective documented Mrs. Morrison's statement with careful attention to specific details that might be useful for developing leads or for presenting evidence if the case eventually resulted in arrests and court proceedings. Witness interviews often provided crucial information that was not available through physical evidence or other investigative techniques, making the quality of these conversations essential to successful case resolution. While Detective Williams conducted witness interviews, Officer Santos maintained radio communication with patrol units that were responding to routine calls throughout the city. The radio traffic provided a continuous soundtrack for night shift operations, with brief exchanges that documented the ongoing encounter between police officers and the various situations that required law enforcement attention during overnight hours. At 2:30, Officer Chun reported that he was investigating a suspicious person call at a downtown business district where a security guard had observed someone attempting to enter a building through what appeared to be unauthorized access points. Such calls were common during night shifts when reduced pedestrian traffic made unusual activities more noticeable, and when business security personnel were more likely to observe and report behaviors that might indicate criminal intent. The investigation revealed that the suspicious person was actually an employee who had forgotten his keys and was attempting to enter his workplace to retrieve personal items that he needed for an early morning appointment. The employee was able to provide identification and contact information for supervisors, who could verify his legitimate access to the building, resolving the situation without arrests or citations. Officer Chun's report documented the incident and the steps taken to verify the employee's identity and legitimate presence at the location, creating a record that would be available if similar situations arose in the future involving the same individual or location. Such documentation helped patrol officers develop familiarity with regular activities and authorized personnel in their assigned areas, improving their ability to distinguish between legitimate activities and behaviors that might indicate criminal intent. The third significant incident of the night shift occurred at 3:45, when Officer Martinez responded to an alarm activation at a residential property where the homeowner was out of town and where neighbors had not observed any activity that might have triggered the security system. Alarm calls required careful investigation because they might indicate burglary attempts, equipment malfunctions, or false activations caused by weather conditions or other environmental factors. Sergeant Kowalski accompanied Officer Martinez to the scene, where they conducted a thorough exterior inspection of the property before contacting the alarm company to determine whether the activation had been caused by specific sensors or by general system malfunction. The investigation required coordination with the security company's monitoring center and with the property owner, who was traveling in another state but who could be reached by telephone. The alarm company's records indicated that the activation had been triggered by a motion sensor in the rear yard of the property, suggesting that someone or something had moved through an area that should have been occupied during the homeowner's absence. The officers conducted a careful search of the yard and surrounding area, looking for signs of attempted entry or for evidence that might explain the sensor activation. The investigation revealed that a large tree branch had fallen during recent windy weather and had landed in a position where its movement might have triggered the motion sensor, providing a plausible explanation for the alarm activation that did not involve criminal activity. The officers documented their findings and arranged for the alarm company to reset the system after the tree branch had been moved to a location where it would not cause additional false alarms. The property owner was contacted by telephone and informed of the situation, expressing appreciation for the thorough investigation and for the officers' coordination with the alarm company to resolve the technical problem. Such incidents were common during night shifts when weather conditions, wildlife, and equipment malfunctions created situations that required police response even when no criminal activity was involved. As the night shift progressed toward morning, the pace of police activity gradually decreased, while officers used the quieter hours to complete administrative tasks and prepare for the transition to day shift. Operations that would begin when business hours brought increased traffic and activity throughout the city. The overnight hours provided opportunities for thorough work on cases and incidents that benefited from careful attention to detail. Officer Santos processed the paperwork for several traffic citations that had been issued during the night shift, ensuring that all documentation was complete and properly filed for processing by court clerks, who would schedule hearings and manage the administrative aspects of traffic violation cases. The citation processing required attention to details that would ensure defendants received proper notice of court dates and that violation records were accurately maintained in database systems. Detective Williams completed his witness interviews and updated case files with new information that had been obtained during the night shift, preparing summary reports that would be available to day shift investigators who might pursue additional leads or conduct follow-up activities related to ongoing cases. The detective division maintained continuous operations by ensuring that information was properly shared between shifts and that investigative momentum was maintained across different work periods. Sergeant Kowalski reviewed the night's incident reports and prepared a summary briefing that would be provided to the day shift supervisor, documenting significant activities and ongoing situations that might require continued attention during the following work period. The shift change briefings ensured continuity of operations and helped maintain institutional memory about developing situations that extended beyond individual work shifts. As morning approached and the first signs of dawn appeared in the eastern sky, the night shift began preparing for the transition to day operations while maintaining readiness to respond to any additional incidents that might occur during the final hours of their duty period. The overnight hours had provided opportunities for thorough police work that complemented the more rapid response activities that characterized busier periods. The police station would soon fill with day shift personnel who would assume responsibility for the continuing cycle of law enforcement activities that protected community safety and maintained public order throughout the 24-hour period. The night shift had contributed its own essential functions to this cycle, providing services that were specifically suited to the conditions and requirements of overnight policing. The quiet efficiency of night shift operations reflected the professional competence of officers who had adapted their skills to the particular challenges and opportunities of overnight law enforcement work, maintaining public safety during hours when reduced staffing required versatility and independence while still providing thorough investigation and documentation of criminal incidents. As Sergeant Kowalski completed her final reports and prepared to end her shift, She reflected on the steady rhythm of night duty that had characterized her 14 years of overnight policing, work that had provided professional satisfaction through its opportunities for careful investigation and its contribution to the continuous protection of community safety that defined the essential mission of law enforcement. The morning light filtering through the station windows marked the end of another night shift that had successfully maintained public safety while providing thorough investigation and documentation of the criminal incidents that had required police attention during the overnight hours. The cycle would continue with the arrival of day shift personnel who would assume responsibility for law enforcement activities during the busier daytime period. The evidence room on the third floor of Central Station had accumulated decades of photographs, each one carefully labeled and filed according to the case numbers that connected them to investigations both solved and unsolved. The room's metal shelving held thousands of manila envelopes, their contents representing moments frozen in time when police photographers had documented crime scenes, evidence, and the aftermath of events that had once dominated headlines but had gradually faded into the city's collective memory. Evidence clerk Dorothy Chun had maintained these photographic archives for 28 years, developing expertise in preservation techniques that protected images from the deterioration that threatened all photographic materials over extended periods of storage. Her careful attention to environmental controls and handling procedures had ensured that photographs from cases dating back to the 1930s remained clear enough to be examined by investigators, attorneys, and researchers who occasionally requested access to historical case files. The earliest photographs in the collection had been taken with large format cameras that required careful setup and extended exposure times, creating images with exceptional detail and clarity that captured crime scenes with documentary precision that modern, instant photography sometimes lacked. These older photographs possessed a formal quality that reflected both the technical limitations of early equipment and the methodical approach that photographers had brought to their documentation. Responsibilities. Case file 1847 from October 1954 contained a series of photographs documenting a robbery at First National Bank that had occurred during the busy Friday afternoon hours when the institution was crowded with customers conducting weekly banking business. The photograph showed the bank's interior as it had appeared immediately after the robbery, with teller windows still containing the cash drawers that had been partially emptied by the perpetrator and with customer areas displaying the scattered papers and overturned furniture that had resulted from the panic that had followed the announcement of the holdup. The lead photograph in the series had been taken from the bank's main entrance, showing the entire interior space with its marble columns and brass fixtures that had been designed to convey financial stability and institutional permanence. The image captured the contrast between the bank's formal architecture and the disorder that had been created by criminal activity, documenting how quickly normal business operations could be disrupted by unlawful behavior. Additional photographs in the series provided detailed views of specific areas within the bank, including close-up images of the teller stations where the robbery had occurred and wider shots that showed the positions of witnesses who had observed the incident from various locations throughout the building. The photographer had documented physical evidence, including footprints, fingerprints, and the note that the robber had handed to the teller demanding money from the cash drawer. Dorothy had examined these photographs many times during her years of maintaining the evidence archives, noting how the formal composition and careful lighting had created images that served both investigative and historical purposes. The photographer had understood that these images would need to provide clear evidence for court proceedings while also creating a permanent record of an event that had affected the entire Community. The bank robbery case had been solved within 3 weeks when the perpetrator, Robert Morrison, had been arrested while attempting to deposit some of the stolen money at another financial institution across town. Morrison had apparently been unaware that banks maintained records of serial numbers for large denomination bills, making it relatively easy for investigators to trace the stolen currency when it was presented for deposit at legitimate businesses. Asterisk. The photographs documenting Morrison's arrest showed a man who appeared surprised and resigned rather than defiant, suggesting that he had not fully considered the investigative techniques that would be used to identify and apprehend him. The arrest photographs had been taken at the police station according to standard booking procedures, creating formal portraits that would be filed with court records and maintained in criminal identification files. Detective Williams, who had investigated the bank robbery case, had noted in his reports that Morrison had been motivated by gambling debts that had created financial pressures beyond his ability to resolve through legitimate means. The detective's investigation had revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate attempts to obtain money, culminating in the bank robbery that had represented Morrison's final effort to address his financial problems before the consequences of his gambling losses became unavoidable. The case file photographs included images of Morrison's apartment, where investigators had discovered evidence of his gambling activities and documentation of the debts that had apparently motivated the bank robbery. The photograph showed a modest living space that had been disrupted by the search for evidence, with personal belongings scattered and furniture moved to allow thorough examination of potential hiding places for stolen money or other relevant materials. Dorothy had observed how these crime scene photographs captured not just physical evidence, but also glimpses into the personal circumstances that had led to criminal behavior, providing insights into the human factors that had transformed ordinary people into defendants in criminal cases. The photographs preserved details about living conditions, personal relationships, and lifestyle choices that helped explain the contexts in which crimes had occurred. Another significant collection of photographs documented a series of break-ins that had occurred during the winter of 1961, when a perpetrator had targeted small businesses throughout the downtown district, apparently searching for cash and easily portable merchandise that could be quickly sold. The photograph showed the aftermath of these crimes, with broken windows, damaged doors, and scattered inventory that testified to the destructive impact of criminal activity on small business operations. The photographer had documented each crime scene with systematic attention to points of entry, areas that had been searched by the intruder, and items that had been stolen or damaged during the break-ins. The resulting images provided a comprehensive record of the perpetrator's methods and preferences, information that had been crucial for identifying patterns that eventually led to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for the crimes. Detective Chun, who had investigated the break-in series, had used the photographs to identify similarities between the various crime scenes, noting that the perpetrator had demonstrated knowledge of small business operations and had targeted locations that contained cash registers and inventory that could be easily converted to money. The photographs had revealed that the intruder had avoided businesses with sophisticated security systems, suggesting either professional experience or careful surveillance that had allowed him to select vulnerable targets. The case had been solved when the perpetrator, Thomas Walsh, had been arrested while attempting to sell stolen merchandise to a pawn shop owner who had become suspicious about the volume and variety of goods that Walsh had been bringing for sale. The arrest photographs showed Walsh as a man in his 30s who appeared to have been living on the margins of society, with clothing and personal appearance that suggested financial difficulties and social isolation. Dorothy had noted how the photographs from this case documented not just the immediate impact of criminal activity, but also the broader social conditions that had contributed to both the crimes themselves and the community's response to them. The images of damaged businesses had been accompanied by photographs of the neighborhoods where these crimes had occurred, showing urban areas that were experiencing economic decline and social problems that created opportunities for criminal activity. The evidence room also contained photographs from cases that had never been solved, images that preserved details about crimes that had baffled investigators despite thorough examination of physical evidence and extensive interviews with potential witnesses. These unsolved cases represented some of the most intriguing materials in the photographic archives, documenting mysteries that had resisted explanation despite professional investigation. Case File 2156 from March 1965 contained photographs documenting the discovery of a body in Riverside Park under circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained despite months of investigation by experienced detectives. The victim, identified as Margaret Thompson, had been found by early morning joggers in a secluded area of the park where she appeared to have died, peacefully without obvious signs of violence or struggle. The crime scene photographs showed Thompson's body positioned naturally on a park bench, dressed in clothing appropriate for an evening walk and carrying personal items that suggested she had been engaged in normal activities before her death. The medical examiner had been unable to determine a definitive cause of death, noting only that Thompson appeared to have died suddenly while sitting in the park during late evening hours. Detective Rodriguez had investigated Thompson's background extensively, documenting her daily routines and social relationships, while searching for any factors that might explain her presence in the park and the circumstances of her death. The photographs of Thompson's apartment showed a neat and orderly living space that provided no obvious clues about why she had been in the park or what had caused her sudden death. The investigation had revealed that Thompson had no known connections to the park area and no apparent reason for being there during the evening hours when her death had occurred. She had been employed as a librarian at the downtown branch and had lived alone in an apartment several miles from the park, making her presence at the location seem random and unexplained. Dorothy had studied the Thompson case photographs many times, noting how the images captured the peaceful nature of the scene while also documenting mystery that had surrounded the circumstances of the woman's death. The photographs preserved details that investigators had hoped might eventually provide insights into what had happened, but the case had remained unsolved despite the thorough documentation. The photographic archives also contained images from cases involving organized criminal activity that had required extended investigation and coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. These cases had often involved complex schemes that had operated across multiple jurisdictions, requiring sophisticated investigative techniques and documentation procedures that had created extensive photographic records. Case File 3247 from 1968 documented an investigation into illegal gambling operations that had been conducted from several downtown businesses that had served as fronts for activities that had generated significant revenue while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. The photograph showed the gaming equipment, financial records, and communication systems that had been discovered during coordinated raids on the businesses involved in the operation. Detective Morrison had led the investigation that had eventually dismantled the gambling network, working with federal agents who had provided expertise in analyzing financial records and identifying the organizational structure that had allowed the operation to function effectively while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. The photographs had documented evidence that had been crucial for understanding how the network had operated and for identifying all the individuals involved in the illegal activities. The investigation had required months of surveillance and careful documentation, with photographers capturing images of suspects, locations, and activities that had provided evidence for prosecution, while also revealing the scope and sophistication of the criminal organization. The resulting photographs had created a comprehensive, visual record of how organized crime had operated within the city during this period. Dorothy had observed how these organized crime photographs differed from images documenting individual criminal incidents, showing the complex relationships and systematic procedures that had characterized professional criminal operations. The photographs had documented not just criminal activities, but also the investigation techniques that had been developed to address sophisticated forms of illegal behavior. As Dorothy continued her review of the photographic archives, she encountered images that documented the evolution of criminal investigation techniques and the development of new technologies that had enhanced law enforcement's ability to document and analyze evidence. The photographs from earlier decades showed investigators using basic equipment and procedures, while later images revealed the adoption of advanced photographic techniques and scientific analysis methods. The evidence room contained photographs documenting the introduction of fingerprint analysis, ballistics testing, and other forensic techniques that had transformed criminal investigation during the mid-20th century. These images showed police laboratories and analysis equipment that had provided investigators with tools that had not been available to earlier generations of law enforcement personnel. One series of photographs documented the establishment of the police department's first crime laboratory in 1962, when the city had invested in equipment training that allowed local investigators to conduct scientific analysis that had previously required coordination with state or federal agencies. The photographs showed the laboratory facilities and the personnel who had been trained to operate sophisticated testing equipment. The crime laboratory photographs captured a period of significant advancement in law enforcement techniques, when scientific methods had begun to provide objective evidence that had enhanced the accuracy and reliability of criminal investigations. Dorothy had noted how these images documented not just technological progress, but also the institutional commitment to professional development that had characterized the police department during this transformational period. The photographic archives also contained images that documented community policing initiatives and crime prevention programs that had been developed to address underlying social conditions that contributed to criminal behavior. These photographs showed police officers working with community organizations, schools, and social service agencies to develop comprehensive approaches to public safety that extended beyond traditional law enforcement activities. One collection of photographs documented a youth outreach program that had been established in 1969 to provide recreational activities and educational opportunities for young people who lived in neighborhoods where poverty and social problems had created conditions that increased the risk of criminal involvement. The photographs showed police officers working with children and teenagers in settings that emphasized positive relationships rather than enforcement activities. Dorothy had observed how these community policing photographs represented a different approach to law enforcement that had emerged during the 1960s and 1970s, when police departments had begun to recognize that criminal activity was often connected to broader social problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than simply arrest and prosecution. As evening approached and Dorothy prepared to close the evidence room for the day, she reflected on the decades of history that were preserved in the photographic archives and the stories that these images told about crime, investigation, and community response to criminal activity. The photographs represented not just documentation of individual cases, but also a comprehensive record of how one city had encountered and addressed the challenges of maintaining public safety across several decades of social change. The faded images would continue to rest in their climate-controlled storage, available for future researchers and investigators who might find new ways to interpret the evidence they contained, or who might discover connections between old cases and new investigations. The photographs preserved moments in time that had once been urgent and immediate, but had gradually acquired the historical significance that came with age and perspective. The evidence room settled into silence as Dorothy secured the photographic archives for another night, knowing that these images would maintain their vigil over the city's criminal history, while new photographs were being taken at crime scenes throughout the community, continuing the cycle of documentation that preserved both the facts of criminal activity and the efforts that had been made to understand and respond to it. In the gathering darkness, the photographs rested in their envelopes and filing cabinets, holding their secrets and their stories while the city around them continued its endless encounter with the complexities of human behavior that had generated these images and that would continue to create new mysteries for future investigators to document and attempt to solve. The downtown bridge spanning the Clearwater River had been built in 1923. Its steel and concrete structure, designed to carry the growing traffic between the city's commercial district and the Corcho residential neighborhoods that were developing on the eastern side of the water. For more than 50 years, the bridge had served as both a vital transportation link and an unwitting witness to the human dramas that had unfolded in its vicinity, creating layers of memory that were embedded in its physical presence and in the collective consciousness of the community it served. City historian Margaret Walsh had spent 15 years documenting the stories that connected specific locations throughout the city to the criminal events that had occurred there, creating an informal archive of how places acquired meaning through their association with significant incidents. Her research had revealed how buildings, streets, and public spaces accumulated historical significance that persisted long after the immediate circumstances that had created their importance had been forgotten by most residents. The bridge had acquired its own collection of associated stories during its decades of service, beginning with an incident in 1927 when a bank robber named Thomas Morrison had attempted to escape from pursuing police officers by abandoning his automobile at the bridge's eastern approach and fleeing on foot across the span toward the downtown district. Morrison had been apprehended halfway across the bridge, ending a chase that had begun at First National Bank and had continued through several downtown streets before reaching the river crossing. The arrest had been witnessed by dozens of people who had been crossing the bridge during the late afternoon hours when downtown workers were returning home to their families. The incident had been reported in the evening newspaper with enough detail to create a vivid account that had been discussed throughout the community for weeks afterward, establishing the bridge as a location associated with dramatic criminal events in the public imagination. Margaret had discovered that the Morrison incident had been the first of several criminal events that had occurred on or near the bridge, creating a pattern of association that had gradually transformed the structure from a simple transportation facility into a landmark connected to the city's encounter with crime and law enforcement. The accumulation of these incidents had created a form of institutional memory that persisted even when specific details about individual events had been forgotten. In 1934, the bridge had been the scene of a tragic suicide when Mrs. Dorothy Chun, despondent over financial losses that had resulted from her husband's failed business ventures during the Depression, had jumped from the bridge's pedestrian walkway into the river below. The incident had shocked the community, not just because of its tragic nature, but because Mrs. Chun had been known as a devoted mother and church member who had appeared to be coping successfully with the economic hardships that had affected many families during this period. The police investigation into Mrs. Chun's death had revealed the extent of her family's financial troubles and the personal despair that had been hidden behind her public appearance of resilience and faith. Detective Rodriguez had documented the circumstances leading to her suicide in reports that had described how economic pressures had created psychological burdens that had proven too overwhelming for someone who had previously been regarded as emotionally stable and socially connected. Margaret's research had shown how Mrs. Chun's death had affected community attitudes toward the bridge and toward suicide prevention, leading to the installation of higher barriers and emergency communication equipment that had been designed to deter similar incidents and to provide assistance for people who might be contemplating self-harm. The physical modifications to the bridge had served as permanent reminders of the tragedy, while also demonstrating the community's commitment to Katsi, preventing similar deaths. The bridge had also been associated with less tragic but equally significant criminal events, including a series of vehicle thefts that had occurred during the early 1940s, when automobiles had been stolen from downtown parking areas and then abandoned on or near the bridge after being used for transportation to other criminal activities. The theft ring had been operating throughout the region, stealing cars for use in burglaries and other crimes, before abandoning them in locations that were convenient for the perpetrators. But that created investigative challenges for law enforcement agencies. Detective Morrison, who had investigated the vehicle theft ring, had noted that the bridge's location made it an ideal spot for criminals who needed to abandon stolen vehicles while maintaining access to multiple escape routes through downtown streets or residential neighborhoods. The investigation had eventually identified the theft ring's members and had led to arrests that had eliminated the criminal organization, but not before several dozen vehicles had been stolen and abandoned in the bridge area. Margaret had found that these vehicle thefts had created lasting associations between the bridge and criminal activity in the minds of residents who had lived through the period when automobile security had been a significant community concern. The incidents had been discussed in neighborhood meetings and had influenced decisions about where people chose to park their vehicles when visiting downtown businesses or attending events in the Central District. The Oak Street neighborhood, which extended several blocks north of the downtown commercial district, had its own collection of buildings and locations that had acquired significance through their connections to criminal events. Margaret's research had documented how certain addresses had become part of local folklore through their association with notorious crimes or through their role in investigations that had captured public attention. The apartment building at 247 Oak Street had been the site of a murder in 1951 when Mrs. Creed had been the site of a murder in 1951. Patricia Walsh had been killed during what appeared to be a burglary attempt that had gone wrong when the intruder had encountered unexpected resistance from the apartment's occupant. The case had been solved when the perpetrator, Robert Anderson, had been arrested 3 weeks later while attempting to sell jewelry that had been stolen from Mrs. Walsh's apartment. Detective Chun had investigated the Walsh murder as part of a broader examination of break-ins that had been occurring throughout the Oak Street neighborhood during a period when increased unemployment and social disruption had created conditions that had contributed to rising crime rates. The investigation had revealed that Anderson had been conducting surveillance of the neighborhood for several weeks, identifying apartments that appeared to be unoccupied during predictable hours, when residents were at work or engaged in regular activities. The Walsh murder had shocked the neighborhood, not just because of its violent nature, but because it had demonstrated how criminal activity could intrude into residential areas that had previously been considered safe from serious crimes. The incident had led to changes in security practices throughout the neighborhood, with residents installing better locks, organizing informal watch groups, and modifying their daily routines to reduce their vulnerability to similar attacks. Margaret had learned that the building at 247 Oak Street had struggled to maintain full occupancy for several years after the murder, with prospective tenants expressing reluctance to live in an apartment building that had been associated with violent crime. The building's reputation had eventually recovered as memories of the incident had faded and as new residents had moved into the neighborhood without knowledge of its criminal history. The small park at the intersection of Oak Street and River Avenue had been the location of several drug-related arrests during the late 1960s, when changing social conditions and the availability of illegal substances had created new challenges for law enforcement agencies. The park had been popular with young people who had used it as a gathering place for social activities that had sometimes involved the use or sale of illegal drugs. Detective Williams had worked extensively in the Oak Street area during this period, developing expertise in drug-related investigations while also building relationships with community members who had been concerned about the impact of illegal drug activity on neighborhood safety and quality of life. The detective's approach had emphasized cooperation with parents, teachers, and social service agencies that could address underlying problems rather than simply arresting young people whose drug involvement might have been symptomatic of broader social or personal difficulties. The park had been redesigned during the early 1970s with improved lighting, better sight lines, and recreational facilities that had been intended to encourage positive use while discouraging activities that had attracted criminal behavior. Modifications had been successful in transforming the park from a location associated with illegal drug activity into a community asset that had served families and legitimate recreational activities. Margaret had documented how the park's transformation had demonstrated the possibility of changing the associations that connected specific locations to criminal activity, showing how physical improvements and community engagement could overcome negative reputations that had developed around particular places. The success of the park renovation had influenced similar efforts throughout the city where problematic locations had been redesigned to promote positive activities. The Riverside Manufacturing District, which had developed during the early 20th century along the industrial corridor that extended south from the downtown commercial area, had its own history of criminal activity that reflected the social and economic conditions that had characterized working-class neighborhoods during periods of economic change and industrial transition. The former textile factory at 451 Industrial Boulevard had been the site of a major labor dispute in 1946 when striking workers had clashed with replacement employees and security personnel hired by factory management to maintain production during the work stoppage. The confrontation had resulted in several arrests and had attracted regional attention to labor relations issues that had been affecting industrial communities throughout the area. Detective Rodriguez had been involved in maintaining order during the labor dispute, working to balance the legitimate rights of both striking workers and factory management while preventing violence that might have escalated the conflict and endangered public safety. The detective's reports had documented the complex social and economic factors that had contributed to the labor dispute while also describing the specific incidents that had required police intervention. Margaret had found that the textile factory incident had created lasting divisions within the community that had persisted long after the labor dispute had been resolved and the factory had resumed normal operations. The incident had affected relationships between workers and management, between different ethnic groups that had been employed at the factory, and between residents who had supported different sides during the conflict. The factory building had eventually been converted to other uses when textile manufacturing had declined during the 1960s and 1970s, but its association with labor conflict had remained part of neighborhood memory among residents who had lived through the period when industrial disputes had been significant factors in local politics and community relations. The warehouse district that had developed adjacent to the railroad tracks had been the location of numerous criminal incidents related to cargo theft, illegal gambling, and other activities that had taken advantage of the area's industrial character and reduced police presence during evening hours when most businesses were closed and the area was largely deserted. Detective Morrison had worked extensively in the warehouse district during the 1950s and 1960s, developing expertise in investigating crimes that had involved organized criminal activity and coordination between multiple perpetrators. The detectives' investigations had revealed how criminal organizations had used the warehouse district's transportation, infrastructure, and relative isolation to conduct illegal activities that had generated significant revenue while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. Margaret's research had shown how the warehouse district's criminal associations had influenced urban development decisions and had contributed to the area's economic decline during the 1970s, when legitimate businesses had begun to avoid locations that had acquired reputations for criminal activity. The area had eventually been redeveloped during the 1980s with improved security and different types of businesses that had gradually changed its character and reputation. The downtown commercial district itself had accumulated its own collection of locations that had been shaped by their associations with criminal events, creating a hidden geography of crime that existed alongside the visible commercial and cultural activities that defined the area's public identity. Margaret had mapped this hidden geography, identifying specific buildings, alleys, and public spaces that had played roles in significant criminal cases. The alley behind Morrison's drugstore had been the site of several muggings during the 1960s, when increased foot traffic in the downtown area had created opportunities for criminals who had targeted pedestrians carrying cash or valuable personal items. The alley's location had made it an ideal spot for such crimes because it had provided concealment for perpetrators while also offering multiple escape routes through connected passages that had led to busy streets where criminals could disappear into pedestrian traffic. Detective Chen had worked to address the mugging problem by coordinating with business owners to improve lighting and eliminate hiding places that had been used by criminals, while also increasing police patrol coverage during hours when the alley had been most frequently used by pedestrians. The crime prevention efforts had been successful in reducing criminal activity in the alley, but not before several people had been injured, and the area had acquired a reputation that had affected business operations and pedestrian behavior. Margaret had observed how criminal incidents in downtown locations had often had economic consequences that had extended far beyond the immediate costs of individual crimes, influencing business decisions, property values, and urban development patterns in ways that had shaped the city's physical and economic character over extended periods. The old courthouse square had been the location of several political demonstrations during the 1960s and 1970s that had sometimes resulted in arrests when protests had violated permit requirements or had involved activities that had been defined as illegal under local ordinances. The demonstrations had reflected broader social conflicts that had been occurring throughout the nation during this period, but they had also created specific associations between the courthouse square and political dissent in the local community. Detective Williams had been responsible for maintaining order during many of these demonstrations, working to balance the constitutional rights of protesters with the need to maintain public safety and prevent property damage that might have resulted from uncontrolled crowd behavior. The detective's experience had provided insights into how law enforcement agencies could respond to political demonstrations in ways that respected civil liberties while also protecting community interests. Margaret had documented how the courthouse square demonstrations had created lasting debates about the appropriate limits of political expression and the role of law enforcement in managing social conflicts. The incidents had influenced local policies regarding demonstration permits and had contributed to the development of crowd control techniques that had been used in subsequent situations involving large public gatherings. As Margaret concluded her research into the criminal geography of the city, she reflected on how places acquired meaning through their association with significant events and how these associations persisted in community memory, even when the specific circumstances that had created them had been forgotten or had lost their immediate relevance. The city's landscape contained layers of history that connected past and present through the stories that had occurred in specific locations. The buildings, streets, and public spaces that had been shaped by their connections to criminal events had become part of the city's institutional memory, creating a hidden archive of stories that informed community understanding of crime, law enforcement, and social change. This geographical memory had influenced how residents understood their city and how they related to the places where they lived, worked, and conducted their daily activities. Margaret's research had revealed how criminal events had contributed to the ongoing process of urban development and change, influencing decisions about land use, architectural design, and community planning that had shaped the city's physical character. The legacy of these events persisted in the built environment and in the collective consciousness of residents who had inherited both the benefits and the burdens of their community's criminal history. The city itself had become an archive of memory, its streets and buildings preserving the stories of human conflict and resolution that had defined its character and had contributed to its ongoing evolution as a place where people attempted to create meaningful lives together despite the challenges and complications that had emerged from the complexity of urban social life. In the gathering evening light, as Margaret walked through the downtown streets that had been the setting for so many of the stories she had documented, she observed how the past remained present in the physical landscape, while new stories continued to unfold in the same locations where previous generations had struggled with similar challenges and had attempted to build communities that could provide safety, prosperity, and opportunity for all their residents.